Oh, fuck.
While there's always been some contention as to where exactly the dark age of Sonic began in the mid-2000s, there's almost no question that 2005's Shadow the Hedgehog was most certainly the most prolific representation.
Shadow the Hedgehog is probably the lowest point of the franchise.
But Shadow the Hedgehog offers nothing to me. Nothing. When it's not frustrating me with its absolutely horrible structure, it's putting me to sleep with its level design, forgettable music, lame-ass story, bleak graphics, and the fact that I have to play certain levels over and over again.
Poor controls, poor level design that doesn't allow Shadow to use speed properly, the gunplay is pointless, poor missions, poor stages, and the story, completely ruined Shadow's character.
Enter the 2005 game Shadow the Hedgehog, and it got Shadow wrong big time.
This isn't fun. Whoever thought this was fun is not a fun person.
With the Dark Age games, would just go horribly wrong in some way or another. Shadow the Hedgehog is not a good game. I think the story is a complete disaster. The gameplay is far worse than any of its 3D Sonic brethren. It was built on the foundation of plainly bad ideas.
He's not evil, he's awesome. I love Shadow the Hedgehog.
I really don't know where to begin with this video. There's so many things that I'd like to start with, but I have to organize my thoughts as I write this. So I think the most important thing to start with is why I'm doing this video in the first place. I've been a Sonic fan for years, first being introduced to the series as a small kid with Sonic Adventure 2 Battle and the infamous Sonic Adventure port on the Nintendo GameCube. And from there, my care from the series and its characters were born. I grew up watching Sonic X Season 1 on 4Kids and eventually got games like Sonic Heroes and the Sonic Mega Collection, where I found more to the series than what I already knew. I was invested in its history, its games, their stories, and especially the characters. And out of all the characters within the games I was introduced to, I was drawn to one the most, and that was Shadow the Hedgehog. In his debut game, Shadow was a mysterious, cunning, pent-up, sophisticated yet condescending antagonist. I'd never seen a villain like this before as a young kid, and when I got a chance to play as him during the dark story of Adventure 2, he felt different compared to playing as Sonic. Yes, they were identical in terms of gameplay, but something drew me to him more. He was just cool. Now, at this age, I never beat games that often. I was very much little and very bad at video games, so I never progressed much outside of Radical Highway in the Dark Story or Mission Street in Hero Story. So when I received Heroes, I was ecstatic. I wanted to see where Shadow was now and wanted to see what became of him. However, Heroes really confused me when I learned within the first cutscene of Team Dark's story that Shadow had lost his memory. Now, again, at the time, I never knew why and how he lost it, because I never beat Adventure 2. And like Adventure 2, I never beat Heroes. I was never that good with video games, and I couldn't get past Ocean Palace in each campaign. It was that bad. Despite all this, I still wanted to play them both when I had the games at the time to advance the story. I wasn't aware of the internet at the time, so it was up to me to finish the stories instead of Googling what happens. However, my family did wonderful things every summer, and one of those things involved moving. A lot. One move in particular kept me away from my video games since the house was so small. I was stuck with just my N64 and my GameCube and only a handful of games. But Adventure 2 and Heroes were in storage, so for the time I had forgotten about Sonic and instead was stuck with finishing Mario Sunshine and Donkey Kong 64. That was until one day, after a snowy day of school, I saw probably the hypest commercial of my life at that point.
Discovering the secret of my past will be nearly impossible. I'll take those odds. Meet Shadow the Hedgehog. His mysterious past holds the key to the world's future. Is he a hero or a villain? You decide. Either way, you'll have a blast. Rated E10 for ages 10 and up.
From that moment, I was psyched. Not only was I getting a new Sonic game, but a game that centered around the one character I wanted to see the most. To me, this was looking like an Adventure 2 with the fat trimmed from it. No more characters I didn't care for, no more hunting for pieces of the Master Emerald, no more having to get through 3 to 4 kinds of those levels to finally play a speed level. This is all I wanted. I begged my mom and dad. I wanted the game for Christmas every time I saw the game in Walmart. And thing is, my dad saw no problems, but my mom had a strong aversion towards certain video games. She subscribed to a camp that believed violence in video games led to violence in real life, and as she saw the gun in Shadow's hand, she held concern about buying it for 6-year-old or 7-year-old me, and even said I shouldn't have it. My whole reaction to the cover was of no concern or warning. My rationale behind it wasn't anything to be alarmed by. Cartoons and media that I grew up with had plenty of quote-unquote violence within them, and I never saw a problem with Shadow holding a gun. Plenty of cartoon characters I knew handled guns before, so to me that just meant this game was serious. And while I was just as excited seeing that game on Christmas Day 2005 to when I saw the commercials, hearing the first sound effect in the game changed my mood immediately. Albeit the back of the box gave off some warning signs as well. Shadow having a fang, scary-looking demon figures, humans that look like they belong in a quote-unquote adult game. It seemed like it was all trying too hard. That became all too apparent with the intro. Intense metal music, war, violence I would expect to see in something akin to those adult games I heard about was everywhere. Even the title screen and menu were styled that completely clashed with the nightlife-esque aesthetic of Sonic Adventure 2. While this unnerved me, I still pressed on and was optimistic about seeing the game I'd wanted for a month. From there, the disappointment settled in. Girls getting shot, my hero saying words I wasn't allowed to say, villains that didn't seem like a cartoon anymore and genuinely felt scary. I had passed on the game, and my interest in Sonic was completely lost. All I really wanted was the same desire for progression that I had felt in Sonic Adventure 2. And I had never gotten that in either the little bit of gameplay I had from Heroes or Shadow. I guess I felt like Sonic wasn't the game series I really should invest time in. Flash forward years later, and I was now actively on the internet, exploring everything I could and on everything in games that I had missed out on. And while on a marathon of spoiling every final boss for every game I had never finished as I was young, I saw the perfect chaos and Final Hazard fights on YouTube, and in that moment, I had to finish the Sonic Adventure saga. At this time, Sonic Colors had just come out, and people were blasting Sonic everywhere across the internet about how Sonic was destroyed, and people yearned for the days where Sonic was good. So what a better time to go back to these games than now? I pulled the games from storage, and the rush of both nostalgia and experiencing new things I'd never seen before in the game were coming at me. I was in love with these games again. Sonic wasn't just cool to me. The internet convinced me he was sick. Lost World, Final Egg, Crazy Gadget, Final Chase, and both final battles were some of the most impactful game changers I witnessed for the series. I was more invested in the characters than ever before. Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, Amy, Rouge, Eggman, and Shadow. They all put a big part into what made the games great. I was older now, and I appreciated every aspect of the games for what they were. I liked the interactions they had, the banter, the story, the world building, the lore, and especially the adventure behind them. And while I got near the end of Adventure 2, something in me felt off. There's a certain feeling you get after beating a game. Yeah, the journey's over, but you'll have a new one eventually. Mario, Pokemon, Zelda, Pikmin, they all gave me that impression despite how long it was to get to that next installment. But after beating these two games, I felt it was gonna change. I don't know if it was because of the things I heard regarding Sonic's present status, or the fact that the game made an impact on me that I couldn't completely process, but the end of Sonic Adventure 2 gave me a somber chill. This feeling is something I cannot to this day describe, but it felt emotional. I think of games like Kingdom Hearts, or in general, a show like a 2000s anime. This nostalgic feeling. It felt like a goodbye, and after realizing this is how Shadow got his memory lost, it made the experience I had with Heroes much more unenjoyable. He did what he could to fulfill his promise to Maria, and now he's a husk of his former self. In fact, he felt more like a background character compared to someone in Team Dark like Rouge. Heroes gave me a story that felt like a Saturday morning cartoon. Gone was the personality and stakes that Sonic Adventure 2 gave me, and now I have cardboard cutouts of characters I absolutely loved at one point, with a villain that didn't have a detailed and mysterious past. Instead, I was given a character that felt more cartoonish and over the top than even Eggman was, which especially sucks because I had no past with this character. I'm sorry, Metal Sonic fans. So, all of these feelings and experiences led me to revisiting Shadow the Hedgehog. I wanted that taste for a story and adventure again, even if it might have been overcooked or too dark. I wanted something. I wanted proper closure to the characters I loved. So, taking a sigh and preparing for a chore of a game, I started my first playthrough. Well, to this day, after 100%ing the game not once, not twice, but 3 times, looking through every single possible video I have seen of this game, hearing it mentioned in brief from memes to YouTube personalities to reviews to even Sega themselves as a joke, I can tell you all right now, you have been wrong about this game for years. I too once saw this game as a laughingstock and thought of it as too edgy for me, but ever since I revisited it, I will not stop defending this game until further notice. This game is more than what it betrays at surface value. This game is something most adventure purists wanted, but never could accept because, quote, it looks bad. This isn't like the Star Wars prequels where they take a lengthy amount of dissection to explain why they're bad. This game is good, and you judge it because it's, quote unquote, not your Sonic game. You watch people like Some Call Me Johnny or Ant Dude and decide, yeah, they don't like it, so I don't like it. Well, I've been sitting on this for a long time, and I think now it's finally time to explain to you how not only was this your true story sequel to Sonic Adventure 2, how this was not only the true end of Sonic's adventure era, but how this game is quite possibly the last time Sonic was at his peak. This is why Shadow the Hedgehog matters. This video is going to be an in-depth analysis, critique, defense, and explanation of the game and the character tied to it. I should also preface this video by saying this is not a response to critics of the game, but rather a response to stereotypes, misconceptions, ill-informed opinions of the game and its character. Shadow as a character is probably one of the biggest laughingstocks to his series, if not one of the biggest in video games, all due to the identity critics and detractors have made of him and due to the first impressions his own game gives. And I'm here to clear the air of the misinformation on his character and some criticisms about his game as well. I will be dissecting as much of the game as I possibly can to reach an objective look at the value both him and his game have. I am unsatisfied with the content made on this game as it either floats towards praising it borderline hyperbolically or ironically, or only negatively bashing on it due to the easy content and clicks it can make someone. Occasionally you will find good reviews of this game that dive into both the good and the bad, a great example being the Geek Critique's fantastic and informative review of this game, or King K's review. But the internet and people in general tend to thrive on negativity, and from this, points about the game that make it good are tossed aside to focus on its flaws, making its reputation even worse over time, and people who genuinely have good things to say are intimidated to voice anything to the majority that parrot opinions. I do not believe my stance on this game has anything to do with nostalgia, as I had experienced this game before and revisited it with a bad taste in my mouth from playing it the first time. I have had this happen before in Sonic games both ways. I liked Heroes as a child, but now find it to be one of the worst Sonic games made. I hated Sonic Lost World, but came to really enjoy it when I revisited it for a 100% playthrough. I know I will not be completely without my biases, as I am a human with error, and I know I will be missing things throughout this video, but I seriously wish to deliver you the objective value this game holds at best as I can do with this time, energy, and critical thinking put into this video. Objective value for content can be a tricky subject to identify, especially since there are so many components that make something like a game good or bad. But what is provable is what the game puts emphasis on being a vital part of it. Gameplay, story, design, these are the three biggest things that define what Shadow the Hedgehog is, and because of this, these qualities will become what shows its value compared to the rest of the series. Presentation can arguably be a big component to the value of media for a person, and it's something that Sonic is known for. But there's a big difference between presentation and execution. You may not like the way a game looks, but that does not mean the game can be objectively bad. Sonic Adventure is a great example of this. While flawed in both presentation and execution, the absolute majority of the execution within the game is phenomenal and timeless, and this is why it's still considered one of the best Sonic games. On a broader example, you may not like Lord of the Rings for the way it looks or perceive it as boring, but that does not make Lord of the Rings an objectively bad or boring piece of media within the realm of content it lies within. It has value due to the criteria set up for it by similar media and not surface-level observation or first impressions. That being said, I will be looking at everything I can in this game, and not just the three major components that form its identity. Every part of the game counts. With all that out of the way, let us begin. I will be tackling the story of this game first, as it was arguably the most important thing that made up the game, and it's probably the whole reason the game was made in the first place. I'll also be tackling the writing and conclusion of the game as well in separate sections, with the latter being the final section. The game's protagonist also happens to be one of the main reasons why I'm making this essay in the first place, as I see so many videos, so many reviews, and so many posts crying about the changes Sega has made to both Shadow and the rest of the Sonic cast, and despite all the videos I've seen, they all tend to harp on this game for being the catalyst that made Shadow what he's seen as today, despite this game having the most important dissections of Shadow's character, and probably the best writing for a character we would get out of a Sonic character within the games. Sure, Shadow was told to give humanity a chance to be happy in Sonic Adventure 2, but that purpose in his life is not forgotten, but expanded upon in his own game. After the events of Sonic Heroes, Shadow ponders upon his purpose after not remembering anything. All he knows are the events and people he's met in Heroes, the threat of Eggman, the gruesome memory of Maria Robotnik's death, and his own name. If I were him, I'd be frustrated too if I didn't know any answers and was supposed to pretend to know what's going on. On top of this gruesome image of Maria getting brutally killed in front of him shows how barbaric and violent humanity can be. Really, the death of Maria, whether he knows what happened or not at this point, was the death of his own innocence, which makes his comment about humanity completely appropriate in the opening scene, if all he knew of them was brutal violence. People say this is a betrayal of his character completely, but this isn't Shadow by the end of Adventure 2, where he values Maria's promise. He's almost back to square one, but with even less information due to his memory loss. Calling this a backtrack in his development is just ridiculous when you haven't even reached the end of the game yet. Shadow, for the most part, was just in for the ride with Rouge and Omega. He wanted to know more about himself and was willing to put the past behind him, but all he was given were just more questions at the end of his team's story. All of this is just a burden on him since he doesn't know who to approach or what to do. I imagine he'd want to be alone to process most of what he's witnessed, so you could see why he'd be alone in the first place. You would think he would ask Rouge or Sonic about all that's happened to him, but I don't even think they could explain his motives or purpose well to him either. And when they do, that ends up being one of the hypothetical endings where Shadow is completely aligned with Sonic and acts heroic and over the top. Maybe they told him of his selfless sacrifice to save the Earth, because I don't think some of his allies would really be keen on breaking out the truth that they think they know about Shadow. Rouge basically read out Gerald Robotnik's diary during the events of Sonic Adventure 2, and it sounded to her and everyone within the room that Shadow was almost made as a device for the genocide of humanity. Hell, Shadow was with Rouge during the majority of Heroes and was never told anything by her. She almost brushed off his amnesia as an inconvenience to her, but a way to gain an ally as well. Gerald never revealed what Project Shadow was, or what it was meant to be about, which is an answer we get in this game. It wasn't until later in Adventure 2 that Amy was the one that awoke the promise Maria asked of him, and it was the most he had ever opened up to about his intentions. Shadow wanted to, essentially, destroy the entire world like Gerald Robotnik. He wanted to end his life, and he knew it, even his own. He never got close to anyone, not even his own teammates. Eggman thought Shadow followed his intentions to conquer the world, but Shadow was tricking him and, for the most part, Rouge the whole time. So at this point, he could get any kind of answer from a different person that knows him about who he was, friend or enemy, and that is the whole reason this game exists. Aside from bringing Shadow back from the dead to a fanned man, but let's all pretend that this was planned from the start. While Shadow was contemplating to himself outside of Westopolis, a comet that appears every 50 years near Earth shows up, and aliens fall from the sky. Before Shadow can get away from the chaos to find more peace and quiet, a mysterious figure named Black Doom gives Shadow a cryptic message, telling him to find the 7 Chaos Emeralds as promised. Shadow, thinking he may have a lead on the questions he contemplated on, decides to find the emeralds. Along the way, he meets with his past allies during Heroes, and with Black Doom as well. Each of them have a different objective for you, which in turn will help Shadow learn about pieces of his own past. It's up to you to choose which alignment to side with and what's part of Shadow's past you will pursue. What does Black Doom show you? What does Sonic show you? Do you believe you should trust those that want you to do a certain objective, or should you actively seek the emeralds? Whatever you choose, it usually leads you down a 3-way path between Hero, Dark, or the neutral alignment. Each stage usually has 3 objectives you can choose from, and at the end of your paths that you choose are 10 possible non-canon endings to the game. If you were to get all 10 endings, you unlock the canonical last story, where Shadow has all of the emeralds in his possession, and finally finds the truth within most of the events he's gone through. Each story path and decision we make leads us to another part of Shadow's life that brings him closer to the truth, and each playthrough has a little bit of the truth, but just enough to get one perspective from it all. Sometimes, Shadow may come to realize who he is from Sonic or Black Doom, or memories might be invoked from interacting with people like the mysterious Gun Commander, who reveals to be a child that witnessed the creation of Shadow and blames Shadow for all of the chaos in the world at this point. It's important that the player explores each part of the game's multiple stories for this reason, because each playthrough only leaves you like Shadow, wanting more answers. Each story is a different perspective that leads us to a new conclusion, so by the time we're ready to fill in all the holes in the overarching story, everything will fall into place. And the interesting thing is, in the end, they even answer the questions left in games like Sonic Adventure 2 as well. Before we even touch the subject of gameplay, I wanted to go over this first and foremost. The format of the progression. I've seen so many people complain about the game's multiple endings and how they quote-unquote don't matter in the end, when that couldn't be further from the truth. These endings help us understand Shadow as a character. While the stories may align to a path that Shadow probably could have taken, and some aren't considered canon, they help us understand Shadow's whole reasoning during this time. Shadow, at one point, becomes convinced he is a soulless creation of Eggman that will prove to be his ultimate creation, and even kills Eggman in 3 endings. It just goes to show that he's willing to move on with such a future ahead of him that feels promising and fulfilling. He finally has a purpose as an ultimate lifeform or an android in his mind. While on the other hand, we see the opposite side of the coin, where Shadow is convinced that being a creation meant for destruction has only caused pain and suffering, and he was unaware of how it affected people on a grander scale, rather than just knowing nothing but his own suffering. Shadow even contemplated taking a bullet for the sins of his past that he fully wants to take responsibility for. He feels guilt despite his bottomless power, and he still believes that he shouldn't exist. The violence he caused the world due to his existence is something that makes him wish the world doesn't go through a past like his, only knowing violence and trauma. This is a huge development from a character that has been known to be very arrogant in past games. Even though he was an android in one timeline, he might have thought differently on his conclusions if all the information was put in front of him. And that's what the last story is. Canonically, all the things that have taken place in the game are put in front of him. Well, minus the Eggman murder and a few other things, but that's really it. So when I hear people complain about multiple branches like this, I feel it's just frustrating to hear. Plenty of games have multiple endings that aren't canon, yet I don't see others complain about them. Oh, you're upset that Shadow wasn't an android or fulfilled son of Black Doom? Are you upset that Ryu never succumbed to the Satsuno Hado in Street Fighter Alpha? Or upset that Simon Belmont didn't just die from Dracula's curse in Castlevania 2? How about the genocide route in Undertale? Better yet, were you upset that Eggman didn't succeed in the Dark Story Adventure 2? Did that story path not matter either? Yes, I know they're not the exact same kind of story continuity that Shadow's story paths are, but the way others complain about this detail is so rampant and silly that I just had to acknowledge that. With that said, let's move on to the gameplay. Now, this is where some of the more vocal criticisms of the game arrive. The game is glitchy, the game is unplayable, the game breaks, I can't control Shadow properly, I'm playing with a gun. Let's back up a bit and dissect the gameplay for what it is. The game has, for the most part, a modified variant of the Heroes engine, which is already a modified Adventure 2 engine. Heroes increase the speed of Adventure 2's startup, acceleration, and max speed. However, in Shadow, I think they adjusted the player's mobility once again, and I believe they might have increased his acceleration a bit too much, and decreased the max speed while they were at it. I could be totally wrong about that speculation, but comparing Heroes and Shadow like that is what I get, and I can't find any information on the modifications from Heroes to Shadow, so this is just an educated guess on my part. I also noticed that Shadow is not nearly as stiff and slowed as Heroes felt in tight spaces, maybe because it's one character compared to 3 in the previous installment, but I digress. What I'm getting at is that Shadow's movement is different compared to the 2 previous main installments he was in, and for the most part, he feels good. I said it. In fact, Shadow plays leagues better than Heroes. The controls don't feel like I'm playing with a worn-down N64 joystick like they do in Heroes. The game also took abilities from Heroes and fixed them too. One in particular is the triangle jump, which if done accidentally in Heroes could mean death. But this time, it gives you the ability to correct yourself in Shadow with mobility on the walls and an easier way to descend by approaching the ledge if you want to get on and just letting yourself fall. The levels are designed in such a way where acceleration wouldn't cause any problems, as you have plenty of options at your disposal to handle things that could stop your momentum or hinder your progress, which I will go over in this section. I'll talk about the levels as a whole when we get to the overall design, but Shadow is composed of sections almost like Heroes, where it's short bursts of speed sections and then smaller areas with waves of enemies that you have to fight. Shadow did something to adjust the flow of this structure and almost blended the 2 type sections together. To tie in with the morality system that Shadow has established with its level progression, not every enemy within your vicinity had to be destroyed to move on, which is more reminiscent of the first 2 adventure games with how they seem to throw enemies around. But for the speed sections, this also meant that there are other enemies and obstacles that you have to watch out for. Depending on your objective, you may need to keep an eye out for what you're going after, lest you may just speed past one of your objectives. This may cause problems depending on what you're looking for, whether it's an enemy or something you need to destroy, but for the most part, objectives big and small are easy to seek out, and with Shadow's controls, you're able to correct yourself if you've gone too far or spotted something out of the corner of your eye. Also, while Shadow does have an easy time stopping on foot, A jump gives you the ability to slow down from your top speed and gives you the opportunity to adjust yourself or even seek out where you want to do a homing attack. It's a very nice slowdown option if you rather not stop so abruptly or feel like you're coming in too fast. Which, one thing I will critique about this game is the homing attack. While it functions perfectly fine, it's slow and has Shadow descend at the same speed and trajectory until a certain amount of time. After a homing attack, Shadow's travel speed will only go up from how fast the homing attack was if the player continues in a specific direction. So it's advised to wait until your homing attack is absolutely done if you want a precise landing for the smaller platforming sections. The speed you get from a homing attack isn't a huge issue, since not only can you wait on the attack to finish and then move on, but Shadow stops on a dime if you notice you're going too fast. Another tidbit about the homing attack that I think is a relative critique with all of the adventure games is the range it has. It's part of the reason with all current and relatively new installments in the series, we have a lock-on icon to tell you where your attack will land. I believe Adventure 1 had gotten it right when it comes to tell how well the range is for a homing attack, but since then it feels like they wanted to increase the amount of distance it can reach within each installment. Shadow is no different, and unfortunately the homing attack has some ridiculous range when it comes to things you can lock onto. Shadow can be an entire platform above or away from an enemy, and he'll still attack them from a ridiculous space away. Thankfully, an accidental homing attack towards an enemy can be corrected with another homing attack back to safety immediately after contact with an object. Rarely you'll have enemies that will move in dangerous areas that can lead to death, but it still confounds me with how far away I'll be and go one way where I meant to go another. I will add as well that this was a trait also found in Heroes, unlike how it was in the first two adventure games. So I can't absolutely fault this game for having these kinds of homing attack physics. The combat as a whole is a lot more easy to understand and way less complex than Sonic Heroes, as it also has a lot of variety when not making other mechanics completely useless. Sometimes enemies can be blasted through with a homing attack and a blue tornado in Heroes, but Shadow can make you stop and think what to use with how enemies are placed and how they're equipped. And the options you need don't require a couple button presses for a change in formation. Aside from a new punch and kick button that this game ripped right from Super Mario 64, Shadow also features two mechanics that cause problems in Adventure 2, and while they're no way near as bad as they were in the previous installment, they have some faults on precision. Once again, the spin dash and light speed attack share the same button. The light speed attack sensitivity has been vastly improved over Adventure and Adventure 2, but unfortunately, you still do need to be a bit precise with your alignment with the rings you want to go through. The spin dash acts more like a fast melee option in this game for certain enemies we'll touch on in a second. While the spin dash does help you go fast instantly and can be used on platform ledges for aerial distance exploits, like in both Adventure and Adventure 2, I really don't see much use for it in standard play for speed, since you pick up speed pretty quickly by just running anyways. Plus, your spin dash doesn't even reach your top speed, and actually caps and slows you down slightly before the attack ends. This may be because they wanted you to be precise with your attack if an enemy or enemies are in your way. Also, unlike in Adventure 2, if you attempt to spin dash while running, you will not somersault but instead slide foot forward for a brief moment. Not only is this a great improvement over the somersault, but it's more useful as well. Say you don't want to stop and either punch, kick, or in this case spin dash through an enemy because you want to keep your momentum going. Well, unlike the somersault where your momentum is completely ruined by accidental use, the slide keeps you at a similar speed to how fast you were going and promptly returns you to a fast pace. This is great for when enemies are coming up and you need a quick way to either stun them so you won't sustain damage, or if you just want to keep going and move on from them. On top of this, if you jump during the slide, Shadow actually jumps backwards to lean in with another option like a homing attack. The options for this kind of quick combat in this game are talked about very little, and I never really see anyone talk about these things due to the weapons. Speaking of which, this is what everyone will not stop talking about: the weapons. I have no clue why people have such an aversion to the weapon system aside for the audacity of having a Sonic character hold a gun, but we'll get to the game's overall edge in the writing section. The weapons themselves, at least the gun weapons, have long, cartoonish, red streaks that show their trajectory, unlike how they're seen in the opening cinematic, being actual, fast-paced, realistic bullets. The way they look reminds me of weapons I see police and armed forces use in cartoons like Spider-Man the Animated Series, how they just shoot lasers out. Even still, aside from the gun weapons, you also have various Black Arms weapons and Eggman Empire weapons that aren't as shocking in the slightest. Would you still have an issue with the guns if they all happen to look like blasters that the Egg Pawns have? I just don't understand what the whole problem is that people have with the weapons. Sega had to think of something to mix up the gameplay of Sonic to feel unique with this pseudo spin-off. Let me ask you this, would you be mad if Nintendo decided to just make a Luigi game and make it just a recolor of Mario and not give him a high jump or a slippery traction? Would you be irritated if Blue Shift just had the same weapons and level designs as the original Half-Life? I welcome the weapons as a good mix-up to the gameplay, one because it no longer makes the game an exact clone of other Sonic games, and two because they actually work and are fun. The weapons are easy to use and satisfying to execute. Most of them have an auto-lock system, so you don't have to be extremely precise with the target. And if an obstacle or enemy is in your way, a weapon is usually an easy answer not to hinder your progress or slow you down. The range-based weapons can suffer from the same problem as the homing attack with attacking certain enemies you may not have targeted, but it never affects your progression within a level at all if you know what objective you're going for. If anything, harming an enemy just adds to 2 out of the 3 of your scores, and fills your chaos meter as well. I never understood why people didn't like using the weapons unless they felt filthy using them, because they didn't belong in their precious Sonic game. The weapons are easy to drop, switch, and fire, and it all requires literally 2 buttons. Switching the weapon does actually share a button with the spin dash and picking things up like crates or bombs to throw, which is a bit overkill, but I never had any accidental input since it's pretty clear where the range of being able to pick up a weapon is. There's also a huge variety of weapons, from projectile-based weapons to melee-based weapons, and some are pretty ridiculous. I'll touch on this in the game's absurd moments within the writing section as well, but some of the melee weapons are great additions, like Shadow completing the internet's hyperbolic look of him with a very large katana, or Shadow picking up a literal traffic sign to beat someone to death with. Also, remember how I mentioned how Shadow has a punch and a kick? If Shadow doesn't have a weapon on hand, he will do those attacks, and if he does, he'll use his weapon. One thing that the punches, slide, melee weapons, and spin dashes are useful for are attacking enemies that draw a shield. These enemies are unaffected by projectiles, and homing attacks don't do well against them either. Instead, they require a melee attack to make them vulnerable. I like this addition to enemies because it keeps you on your toes with how you're able to handle certain threats, and it forces you to try something other than spamming homing attacks for everything in your way. One other thing featured within the game are vehicles. Each vehicle you jump on has a set health bar apart from you, and they will be destroyed if taking enough damage. These machines are also easy to control, but some have a sensitive touch like the hand gliders and the flying aliens that take a few seconds to adjust to, or sometimes they're stiff and admittedly awkward like the Jeep. But my personal favorite has to be the Gunwalker, which is a callback to the Gamma mech stages in both Adventure and Adventure 2 respectively. The mech has absurdly high jump and a slow hovering descent if you hold the jump button after you're airborne, and it's a ton of fun to see how far you can get through a level with one of these things. On top of being able to use these vehicles, you're also able to use your weapons while riding on each one. This is great, not only because it makes you bulkier, but because it also keeps you from being helpless if enemies are nearby. Mentioned earlier when talking about weapons, Shadow also happens to have 2 power-ups that charge over time depending on how many points you have according to what enemies you take out. During the game, depending on what enemies you beat or objects you destroy, it adds to 3 scores within each level. Dark Score, Normal Score, and Hero Score. On top of this, you also have 2 meters that fill up your Hero Energy or Dark Energy, corresponding to your scores in each. Both of these abilities activate automatically, and you are free to unleash them as long as you still have a part of the energy bar remaining. During these power-ups, Shadow can become Hero Shadow or Dark Shadow, and glows accordingly to the power you have. Shadow is invincible during this, and does not spend ammo on whatever weapon he has or picks up. One of these attacks is Shadow's Chaos Blast, which destroys almost everything around you in time, and can also refill your bar if you destroy enough around you. The other ability is Shadow's signature Chaos Control, which can be used to skip through a portion of a level. This ability is not as favored as the Dark variant, as skipping through parts of a level may mean you accidentally skipped over a level objective or a checkpoint, but Shadow's Chaos State can be conserved, and the power-up can simply be used for both invincibility and weapon use. You're never forced to use these power-ups in the game until the final level, where they are necessary to get through the level as a whole. One function that is better than all of the other past Sonic games is this game's camera. Many critics have actually claimed that this is a major problem in gameplay, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. It's precise, it moves at the right speed, and it can be adjusted to any suitable direction at almost any time, and never locks up if needed to be adjusted. During platforming sections, this is a blessing, since the game can have some pretty difficult platforming that we'll touch on in overall design. All in all, the game is structurally sound within its mechanics. The game has no game-breaking glitches like some may say online. The only thing I could possibly think of is the infinite chaos control glitch that's only useful for some neutral story objectives and speedruns, but this is something that a player would have to go out of their way to find. When it comes to this game's different versions, the GameCube seems to have the most glitches, and the PS2 has some pretty bad frame rate dips on certain levels that I never saw on the GameCube. Looking at all 3 versions though, it's safe to say that the Xbox version is the best one in terms of stability, as it seems to have the most consistent frame rate and even the least amount of glitches, with the infinite chaos control glitch being removed. Also, you can play the game in widescreen, so that's always a plus on the Xbox side. I see people compare this game's controls and functions like they're just as bad as something like Sonic 06, which just isn't true. The game works just as well as the other 3 adventure games, and is just as stable and playable. However, one point I never come across until the Geek Critique, an individual who made a very fair and informative review of Shadow the Hedgehog, made apparent the exclusion of what I call a mercy jump, where if you were hit by an enemy, you had the ability to jump and recover from being launched backwards by an attack. Shadow, for some reason, does not have this, and I'm baffled as to why that is. I'm unsure if this was intentional to make the game more challenging, like in the Castlevania series, since this game was trying to appeal to a more hardcore market, or if this was an oversight and nobody caught on to its exclusion. Either way, I find it odd and definitely do not like this. Another thing I never really noticed that the Geek Critique also brought to my attention is the ring factor within the game. Shadow uses rings differently in that each time he gets hit, he loses 10 rings instead of all of them, much like in Sonic Forces. I initially saw this as stupid, but after really going through the game, it's understandable why they would do this. Shadow has a lot more hazardous enemies and obstacles than a regular Sonic game, and when things get compact in combat, it can definitely be harder to pick up your rings. It balances the game a bit, and it never made anything a lot more challenging or easy to me. I just thought I'd bring this up. Aside from that, this game's functions work absolutely fine. It definitely feels different compared to the past 3 Sonic titles, but then again, each installment was different. As you play more, you get used to the controls like any other title. There are certainly no inconsistencies within the movement or the mechanics aside from the homing attacks, occasional lock-on, and constantly I hear the complaint that this game has slippery movement, when really it's only highlighting one awkward portion of your mobility and not judging it as a whole. The controls are not slippery. In fact, the mechanics and the improvements of mobility coming from the past games, your jump and triangle jump as respective examples, give you great influence on where you want to be, aside from maybe the homing attack. Just because Shadow accelerates faster than other games does not make the control completely broken. Most of the critiques that I have seen about this game's controls just show examples of them almost trying to hit every obstacle possible while only running and not putting use to the other options they are given. As I've stated before, I am not making this video as a response to critics, but I must say this kind of thing to show off to your audience who may want to either check the game out or revisit it potentially looks intentionally dishonest and should not be a thing to put in your review at all. Incompetence can also be a factor, but I can never think a game critic can be incompetent. The statement that this game has touchy controls is mind-boggling. This game, while having adjusted the acceleration from Heroes to Shadow, is never designed in a way that would make your control an issue, unless a player is carelessly trying to style their way through a level on their first try. With that said, let's move on to overall design. This is where some of the more critical complaints come in. I'm unsure if it has something to do with it being insignificant to certain people, but since it is a big part of its design and by extension the presentation, it needs to be addressed. I'm not even that much of a snob at all when it comes to graphics. If a game plays well and keeps us entertained, people will usually play it and have no surface level complaints. However, when a game like Sonic Adventure 2, a game from the same console generation almost 4 years apart, has better model designs, flashier effects, and textures that make focal points and backgrounds complement each other, your game has a problem. Almost every existing model from a character in Sonic Heroes is reused for this game, much like how the gameplay and feel is borrowed a bit from it as well. And I didn't even like the designs in Heroes. These models do not suit the tone and story that Shadow set. They feel very cartoonish and out of place with a grayer and grittier aesthetic around them. They're nothing like the pre-rendered cutscenes in the game, which, by the way, are probably the best looking cutscenes of this console generation, second to Sonic Unleashed opening cinematic on the PS2. When I first played this game as a child, I felt psyched seeing the beautiful cinematics that would invest and catch my attention immediately, only to feel ripped off when I beat the first level and see the ugly in-game models carry out the rest of the plot's progression. As petty as it sounds, the downgrade broke a lot of the immersion for me, and I'm sure it did for a lot of others too. Compared to the models in Adventure 2, everything felt detailed about these characters, from their faces, to their skin, to their accessories and clothing. To me, it's like seeing Super Smash Bros. Brawl's Mario rendered side by side next to the official Mario render for New Super Mario Bros. Wii, except the latter is in Gary's mod. Every single 3D Sonic game at this point had a unique look to it that made every game stick out for certain moments to remember it by. And despite the flaws in each one, you know what game it is just by looking at the models. With this, aside from the frame rate differing from Heroes to this game, it almost feels lazy. Shadow was intended to have a series to branch off from this series, so why would you reuse obvious and familiar assets from an existing game to kick off your new spin-off series? Wouldn't you want to stylize your game to make it as original as possible to stand out from your main series? On top of the models looking cartoonish, sometimes the animations look cartoonish as well. Certainly not as bad as Adventure 1's lip flaps or Adventure 2's motion captures. But within the gameplay, it feels jarring to see certain things pop up. Shadow will climb a pole or fall from a decent height, and his limbs will stretch considerably far from looking right. Not even Sonic Heroes, which holds a much more cartoonish looking design, had animations that stood out this much. Enemies tend to act slow, especially gun soldiers who look pudgy and goofy, even compared to the low-poly anime characters in Adventure 1. Most of the enemy variety is pretty diverse in this game, and I can't complain with how much more there is compared to previous entries in the series like both adventure titles, but it's too bad some of them tend to look off within their animations. You can almost pick out each keyframe with how slow they move into place to damage you. Let's diverge into that section right now, actually. Enemies, specifically the Black Arms, suit the tone of the game and have a look to them that stands out from what we've seen in Sonic before. As a whole, they have a really great design. However, I personally feel like they could have used some variety within their appearances, as seeing the same shades and colors on their bodies do make them seem a bit bland. Most of them are very rounded enemies with edged areas somewhere on their body, whether they're on their shoulders, wings, or limbs, and their weapons have unique designs as well. They definitely come off as a more intimidating villain, except for this plant, which is apparently a part of their race and sticks out like a sore thumb within the rest of their designs. I have no idea why this exists and why they didn't try to make it appear like the same with the rest of the Black Arms. Next are the gun enemies. As mentioned before, the soldiers look a bit blocky and disproportional. This may have been because they were trying to give off the impression that they were wearing body armor, but even the legs come off as a bit too large. Gun also has various robots that assist in the fight for Earth, with some enemies coming back from Sonic Adventure 2, like the Gun Beetle and the Bigfoot Mech. Both the enemies have since then been updated and given different classes depending on the level, which adds nice variety and depth to the gun weaponry and expansion since their first appearance. New machines have also been added, like the Gun Trooper and Giga Trooper, which look more like Gundams than a gun mech, and with every gun enemy destroyed, most of the time they will be dropping some sort of military-based weaponry. These are the best designed weapons in the game and simultaneously the most criticized one for the appearance, as they're based off real-life weapons like the semi-automatic rifles being based off weapons like the SG-550 or the M16. Gun also has much bigger ballistics that like rocket launchers, grenade launchers, and miniguns that are all designed well, and they look hilarious when comparing their sizes to the user, and gives diversity for what the player could use to plow through a level. Finally are the Egg Pawns, or as Sonic Heroes would call them, they look mostly unchanged from their appearance in Sonic Heroes, but different classes have been added for the appropriate level, like the Egg PRA or the Jack Bomber. They're easily the most lackluster enemies in the game. Gone the variety of pawns seen in Sonic Heroes, where we now have the basic orange designs that either have swords or laser guns or bazookas. On a small personal note from experience, these enemies also felt like the easiest to take down or felt harmless within whatever objective I was fulfilling within the level. Deep foreshadowing for the game to come. They do their job in representing Eggman's army, and often clash with the opposing side of a battle in a level, but these enemies could have had a lot more to them than what they were given. Actually, Eggman's army did have one enemy class that was added for 2 levels only, the Shadow Androids. Essentially, they were just low-poly versions of Shadow. These androids that were foreshadowed in Team Dark's ending of Sonic Heroes are some of the toughest enemies in the game. They shoot homing missiles from their hands and are able to use your homing attack as well, which gives them great range and option to counter your own homing attack. This makes it so your only options of destroying them are projectile-based weapons or a spin dash, which the latter seems a bit ineffective due to how these things can move compared to other enemies. While they're challenging, some of their fights are optional wherever they appear, and it makes me wish that they were used in other levels for variety. Maybe showing off some unpainted models, either in levels for build-up, could have been a good way to use them. But I digress. The rest of the characters are designed okay. I did mention the gun soldiers looking a bit off, but the human characters in general are probably the worst looking designs in the series. They may have looked better if the proportions were changed to look more accurate to life. For example, the President in Sonic Adventure 2 returns and is polished up to suit the game more, but his feet and hands are way too big for the design they're trying to pull off. Sonic wasn't trying to look cartoonish with its human designs yet, so this comes off bad when it's trying to suit the realistic tone the humans were given. This is probably a nitpick since this was a time where games were one generation behind looking borderline realistic, but it's best to mention this as I'm sure something like a foot or a hand could have been adjusted for a model. Maria also returns to this game, as well as the Artificial Chaos enemies. Maria sadly has the worst look of all the human characters. Her eyes look like a watery, melted puddle of blues, blacks, and whites to emulate an anime-esque appearance for her. They looked fine in her Adventure 2 model, and while both of her in-game appearances look bad, the Adventure 2 one still looks the most appealing due to her slightly better facial features. Unlike her Adventure 2 model, though, her design is a lot more simplified with more solid colors for both her hair texture and clothing. As for the artificial chaos, only one class of this enemy returns, being the spherical P-100s. They look generally the same as their Adventure 2 counterparts, with less detail on their mechanical heads and a more luminescent look with their watery bodies. They are also significantly easier to destroy and are way less hostile. That's pretty much all that there is to be said about the character designs. All in all, some stick well with the level designs like the gun and black arms enemies, while others don't, and can clash with the art style and presentation. Before we get into the level design though, I want to touch in on the menus designs. A small portion of the game, but important to its presentation. The menus are gritty, gray, and dark. They have a grunge style that complements the opening to the game and its music, but when we dive into what the game offers in terms of levels, I feel like they could have been designed differently to give a better look for all of the game's content. Sonic Adventure's menus were styled to suit the more futuristic and streamlined conversion into 3D that Sonic was going through. Sonic Adventure 2's menus, while simplistic in certain ways, gave you a sense of excitement and fun with a nightclub aesthetic to draw you into an exciting experience. Sonic Heroes had bright colors and shapes that pop to fit both the style and personality of the game. Shadow does this as well, but the menus definitely could have used more color to them, because they really don't do some of the levels justice. Which leads us into our next big topic, the level design. Shadow's levels have a wide range of designs that look different from one another. Aside from a couple reskins, like with the Black Comet and Final Haunt, they all feel uniquely crafted. However, like in Sonic Heroes, some sections feel a bit repeated from time to time, where you'll get to a certain section of the level and think, hey, was I here already? The color palette for the levels are very interesting too. While this game gives off a more darker tone, setting the scene with grays, faded scenery, and dark atmosphere, some levels become very bright and energetic with darker enemies sprinkled throughout to give the feeling of invasion and corruption that stays consistent throughout the game. Oranges and yellows are tainted with red and black, and bright neon purples and greens are stained with shades of gray. The level's assets also take on a look of decay and destruction, with bounce pads being rusted and more realistic within the Warzone environment they're present in, and it's a nice attention to detail. Now, how are they structured? With 3 exceptions, the levels are built for straightforward speed and reaching the end goal. Every 3D Sonic game has its loops, its high jumps, and its intense reaction times, and Shadow has all of this present. It's also nice to have diverging pathways in certain levels, a few examples being Prison Island and Cryptic Castle, which helps the levels create a sense of exploration while implementing the mission objectives nicely as well. The 3 exceptions are Central City, The Doom, and Lost Impact. I will get to these 3 when we get to the mission objectives sections later, trust me. While the levels have mostly straightforward progression, some parts of the game are a bit strange to find a way to progress through. An example of this is the section in Final Haunt, where after defeating a certain amount of enemies, this crate unlocks a vacuum weapon that allows you to move platforms back so you can advance. This is just a bit strange because this is one of the only times you'll ever need this weapon to do this kind of thing, and it felt so out of place. I was confused as to what it did for a moment, until I saw the markings across the walls and listened to Sonic's hints. This is probably the only thing that ever made me think twice about what I was doing, though. The levels within this game also remix an idea that made the Sonic games what they are today. During the Genesis era of the series, fast-paced momentum was the prominent draw to the games, but this style of gameplay was slowed down for platforming, and more speed was rewarded for playing the game and its levels again and again as you learn how to handle what the game can throw at you. Shadow's levels and controls are meant to be played with the fast-paced action in mind, but the levels scatter enemies and obstacles within your path that, when playing the game more often, get easier to avoid with learning the layout of a level and timing your movements. Are the obstacles placed within the levels positioned unfairly, or are they so numerous that they cannot be avoided at all? I don't think so. The placement of things, whether they can be enemies or indestructible environments, can be a bit much in Westopolis, but due to how much you will be playing through Westopolis to get the final ending, avoiding everything will be a breeze by your final playthrough, and very fun once you know how to blast through it. It could be intimidating for a newcomer with how harsh Westopolis can be with its constant barrage of aerial lasers, but the first impression that this level gives for the player with its chaotic aesthetic and setup for the tone would mostly draw the player in more to see what else the game throws at you. If you don't have problems with the obstacles in the boost gameplay of Sonic from both Unleashed and Generations, you really shouldn't have a problem with Shadow. Let's talk about one of the additions to this game that separates it from other Sonic games: the missions. Explained earlier, there are usually 3 missions per level: Hero, Dark, and Normal. Most of the time, Hero and Dark missions require you to either destroy, collect, or find things in a level, like a certain number of enemies or things like collectibles or rings. This is very much like the treasure hunting stages from the 2 adventure games, and like Team Chaotix's story mode in Sonic Heroes. However, I do wish there was more variety to these missions that was just what I explained. What they did was fine, but giving us something like having Shadow make it to the goal in a certain amount of time, or racing a certain character throughout a level, or something different aside from collectathon structure would have been a more welcome change, because at times, this constant structure of missions can get bland after a certain amount of them in succession. It would be good to mix up their objectives, like how Sonic Adventure 2 had treasure hunting stages followed by a mech stage and then a speed stage. The game does allow you to pick and choose what you want to do, that's the point, but if a player is going for 100%, I think it would have been better to streamline the missions more to not seem so mundane at times. It's now time for a major criticism of the game: the mission objectives. While being mostly easy to find in levels, have terrible execution. Like its hero's counterpart, with the lack of one particular thing: a radar. You're given a counter with how many objectives you have left within a level, but are never told where an objective you either missed is, or are still looking for, is located. This leads to potential backtracking within the game that can be a chore at sometimes. But luckily, the checkpoint system allows you to go back within a level to previous sections that may hold the objective you're looking for, but this is also a problem because checkpoints don't tell you if an objective is within their area as well, so it's honestly better to just travel back to the first checkpoint and search the entire level more thoroughly. This design overlook can potentially be fatal to the game's replayability for a newcomer if he's used to how previous adventure games worked with the treasure hunting stages. As you play more of the game, your attention to detail and analysis of a level gets better to you, and you're now used to how levels can be, but this is a brutal way to make players learn to be more attentive. A radar, or even better character dialogue that could have given you hints, would have been an easy fix, or even take a page from the adventure games and give you upgrades scattered through the levels. But such a component to this game is non-existent, and you have to learn the hard way. This was definitely something I struggled with on my very first playthrough of the game while revisiting it, and while I didn't have any problems with it later after being more cognitive of where to look in a level, it shouldn't have been a problem in the first place. And this is where we step a bit to level design, and talk about those few exceptions to speed within the game. Let's start with Central City. The level itself is very open and dark and sometimes confusing to navigate through, as you can go from progress in this level to actually going back to a previous area you've already been to. This stage is designed almost entirely around the mission objectives, and is actually one of the only stages that doesn't have a goal ring in it. While navigating through a section of the city would be fine, it just feels like a treasure hunting stage with no radar at all, making you explore the entire level top to bottom in an effort to finish whatever objective you have under a certain amount of time. While the pressure of time pushes you to finish the level as quickly as possible, the confusing structure of the level almost hinders your ability on speed unless you've absolutely mastered the layout of this level and can find and destroy the designated bombs by memory. but Central City is nothing compared to objectively the worst level in the game, Lost Impact. It has an interesting concept, being a level taking place within a flashback where Shadow starts to remember his past after certain events unfold. However, the hero mission in this level has to be one of the most frustrating and boring levels ever put in a Sonic game. Lost Impact is a lot like another flashback stage, The Doom, in terms of design, with a very green and luminescent color choice and structured almost like a maze. This isn't a problem within the neutral objective of the level, since there's only one goal, get to the goal ring. However, the hero mission has you find 35 of the artificial chaos experiments around the Ark to destroy, since they are going berserk due to the nature of the beast they were based around. The problem comes with the design of the level. It's that it's a maze, and the placement of the enemies make you have to look in every single possible location in the level, which is not helped by the fact that some hallways, corridors, and sections of the level are nearly identical with only a few destructible environments and enemies. With how big of a level this is and how many enemies are scattered around pretty far apart from each other, you may spend an average of 25 minutes on this level if you're not knowledgeable within it. This is abysmal. This only gives the game more of a reason to have a radar or better dialogue from someone like Maria, or context-sensitive areas where enemies are still present or have all been destroyed. Aside from these complaints, the rest of the missions are not as bad as one may say online. They range from defusing a set of amount of bombs, to finding a certain character in a level, to destroying a small amount of relatively big and easy to find objects that can be done as quickly and efficiently as getting to the goal ring. Some can have a slow pace to them, like destroying Eggman's ships in some levels, but they're not slow to the point of destroying the pace of the game. There's still urgency within them, with enemies around you and objectives trying to escape, but it's a nice mix-up of the speed stage formula that fuses elements from both the mech stages and the treasure stages simultaneously, and gives the player a lot of room to do whatever they may want within a level, which is a welcome idea considering some stages in past games were only made for certain character classes. They're flawed, and some are executed poorly compared to others, but they don't hinder the game to the point of being monotonous. In fact, at points, they do the opposite, and give variety to each level and playthrough of the game. Speaking of the playthrough, each pathway may contain a certain amount of bosses within a stage. You may complete the dark mission of a level with no problems, but if you beat a hero mission, this may lead to a boss due to the progression of the story. Bosses in 3D Sonic games have varied in quality, some being great challenges to your skills and knowledge of the game, while others can be blasted through with no effort. In Sonic Adventure, the bosses, while grand and having a wide range of assets to challenge the player, mostly involved waiting your turn to attack, rinse and repeat, with a few exceptions sprinkled into that stood out from the rest, like the Egg Viper and E101 Beta Mark II. Sonic Adventure 2 had the same design in mind for bosses, but allowed the player to beat bosses quicker if they became more skillful at the game when they progressed. And Sonic Heroes had some bland bosses, with some just being waves of enemies getting recycled, or beefier versions of previous bosses that can actually be destroyed by spamming the homing attack over and over and not needing to switch to power formation. So, where does that leave Shadow? Well, the bosses take a page from almost every game. Enemies cycle through attacks and areas of invulnerability until there's an opening, but can also be defeated quickly if the player is knowledgeable of what they can use around them. You could wait for an opening in the boss's stages of attack, but you can also strike quickly and more often if you master either the weapons or control of the game. There are definitely some bosses that lack in this development and feel uninspired, like Egg Dealer, which is considered to be the worst boss in the game, and is only defeated by a boost-style chase after the boss is followed by the player using Shadow's homing attack to activate its own attacks against it. Other than Egg Dealer, the boss designs are nice. Some are better than others, but all of them give a nice break from the rest of the game. Although some bosses like Diablon can suffer from the same problems plaguing Sonic Heroes bosses, bosses like Black Doom, on the other hand, have multiple ways of being defeated, and can be a nice challenge. Black Bull is a great example of a boss that can be defeated differently as you start to learn more about the game's mechanics. While you could use the Black Wings to reach his weak spot and time your homing attacks to a repetitive attack on him, you can also take out the Black Warriors surrounding the stage and adjust your speed and jumps to shoot at him from a greater distance. I should also mention that while your Chaos Blast remains the same in battle, your Chaos Control inverts the screen and actually slows down time greatly. And if the timing is right, it gives you the ability to wail on enemies more for a short period of time. And that's pretty much all there has to be said about the single-player side of things. But there's one last thing I should mention, and it's the secret keys. Each level in the game holds 5 of these keys, and when collected, don't require you to recollect them unless you completely wipe your save. Even after exiting the level immediately after collecting a key, they will still be marked as collected, which is very gracious for a collectible. So what do you do with these keys? Well, getting all 5 in a level opens up the secret doors, of course, which contain things that can either add a new section to the level, or help the player get across the level with new weapons, vehicles, or a shortcut. Some of these can be pretty ridiculous and fun, like the armored car in Westopolis that just destroys everything in its path, but some are almost useless within a level. The best example of this is Lost Impact's Secret Door, which gives you a car. This was probably a joke. However, another collectible that you technically have in the game are the A ranks, which, when you obtain them all in sections of the levels, unlocks Expert Mode. This is probably the best reward for 100% in this game, as it's essentially going through every single level in the game with no missions, a set amount of lives, and a higher difficulty. Plain and simple, it's an adventure-era speed section endurance, and it's great with the added mechanics of Shadow like the weapons and chaos abilities. It also happens to have some relevance to the story, as it's technically Shadow cleaning up the rest of the mess on Earth as a training course for Gun. Which is a weird thing, because we hear Black Doom give Shadow advice. Isn't he dead? Maybe it isn't actually Black Doom, maybe it's another threat looming over Shadow, waiting to attack. Find out in Shadow the Hedgehog 2, which will sadly never happen, so just read Sonic Universe. I mean, seriously, they actually made a sequel storyline to this game, and it's pretty good. Getting back on topic, apart from the single player, the game also houses multiplayer elements inside of it. There is the 2-player mode that allows you to play against your friends, and has different colored shadow androids as choices for playable characters, 2 that give you the ability to swap weapons, and 4 stages, which is a huge letdown with how many levels are within the game, and the main goal is to destroy the other player. There's no race modes, no mission mode, just a deathmatch. This is a massive downgrade from Adventure 2's multiplayer, and makes it very bland in comparison to the previous title's variety. Each stage is a remixed version of a single-player stage, and regardless of what stage you picked, the music is always Radical Highway from its Sonic Adventure 2. A nice callback, but it kinda gets old if you play this a lot. The 2-player mode is almost never talked about in reviews or critiques of this game, and despite how simplistic it is compared to the other 3D multiplayer options, it's a small bit of fun with a friend. This will be the only time the camera is a real issue with the game due to how poorly they decided to crop the player view in multiplayer. Instead of making it horizontal, the view is diagonal, which completely butchers the player's sense of what is left and right of them, even making it harder to find your opponent. If it isn't your style of multiplayer, you can technically plug in a second controller during the story mode and play co-op a la Sonic 2 style, where there's no split screen, but as long as you keep up with player 1, you're able to come along for the ride. Some characters really don't do anything as a co-op partner, some can only jump and some just move around, but others can be just as versatile as Shadow, except they can't use any weapons. Oddly enough, one character who can actually attack, jump, and keep up with Shadow is Maria. She does a slap that can damage enemies, and it looks pretty funny when she does this to one of the gun soldiers. Before we touch on the writing section, there's one more thing we need to go over within overall design, and that is the sound design. This is a pretty subjective section of an analysis, but it's still good to have a perspective on since it's still a part of the presentation. As a whole, the music and sound is balanced well to make sure nothing is drowned out over another, unlike how it was in the previous adventure games where some sound effects and music were way too loud to hear the voices during the level or a cutscene. Each weapon and enemy has new sounds that make them stand out, especially the black arms, which probably have the most creative examples. One thing that's nice to hear on occasion are some callbacks. Like the levels, some sounds give reference to the past games like Adventure 2. Shadow retains his signature jump noise, and Sonic does as well, which is a nice touch to differentiate them. In some levels, like the Arc, the rail sounds from Final Chase and Final Rush are back, and it feels nice with how specific they were in capturing the original design as a tribute to the past levels. Also, some mechanics, like the gun mech, sound exactly like Eggman's Walker from Sonic Adventure 2, and it felt good to hear. They really did try their best to give as many nods to the previous Sonic games as possible, and while, yes, they are technically reused assets, these aren't considerable downgrades. If they're not broke, don't fix them. With that said, one huge staple that 3D Sonic games have had over the years, even beyond this game, is amazing music. Despite how bad a Sonic game can be, Sega can put out amazing music no matter the quality of the game. And yes, I must reiterate that music is one of the most subjective things out there next to sound, and it is literally just noise that can be heard different from each ear, but the quality in music is usually agreed upon within the Sonic community. However, I hear from so many critics, even the ones that bring up solid arguments, that this game houses the worst Sonic music, and to that I say, absolutely not. This game has some of the best that Jun Senoue has ever composed. Each track fits the ambience, the mood, the level, and the story perfectly. When all the sounds and voices meld together by the power of the music, you're given a great scene no matter what it is, whether it's exciting, adventurous, goofy, intense, sorrowful, or just climactic. On top of this, the game features a vocal track with primarily alt-rock genres, and has 5 artists featured for the music. The songs usually play during certain cinematics or during the credits of each pathway, which makes me wish they could have done something different with the credits or to show off these songs, as I often just skip through the credits and never really listen to how great these songs were. But the songs are amazing. They all really reflect Shadow's mind after he takes each story path, with lyrics and instruments to support the feeling too. Waking Up by Julian Kay and Chosen One by Mona Lisa are great songs about Shadow accepting the reality of his situation. He either is destined to become a soulless creation bent on perfecting himself as the peak of science, or a reflective individual who laments the problems he's caused to the world in his past, and he wonders if he should keep fighting because it's his duty, or give up to save the world from more harm.
Waking up, breaking out. This is what it's like to be free. Rip it up, tear it down. This is what it means to be free. Wish I may, wish I might be someone else tonight. Sometimes I wish I was never born at all. And I'll try to save the world, 'cause in the end I know I'm the chosen one.
There are other tracks that reflect the more extreme sides of Shadow's journey. Magnify made the amazing yet cheesy All Hail Shadow, which praises Shadow for all of the accomplishments during his journey, and he still stands tall and takes on his duty as a hero despite his rough past. Then there's Almost Dead by Power Man 5000, which, while admittedly being the absolute edgiest song in the game, with even Rob Zombie's brother being the vocalist, the song shows you how off the deep end Shadow goes with his faith in humanity gone after the grooming done by Black Doom and seeing how evil humanity can be on their own. From Shadow's flashbacks and memories to seeing their quick-to-judge nature in real time. At this point, Shadow wants absolute destruction towards the people that have caused him so much pain.
Heaven can't save us, hell is a joke. No place left to
On top of all these, there are also 3 vocal tracks that never made it into the game, and they're great too! In fact, both of them feel like a personal statement that Shadow makes towards 2 major characters. One was another neutral hero song called Broken by Sins of a Divine Mother, which never got into the game due to issues with communications between Sega and the band themselves. The song has a melancholic melody like Chosen One, but it feels more like it was addressed to Maria rather than Gerald, as it almost sounds like Shadow admits disappointing and failing Maria in a way, like he will never be good enough. And really, it sounds like Shadow just wants to live his own life, with nothing dictating him what to do, because he can't be what another person wants him to be, which is the point of the 3rd unused track, All of Me, also by Sins of a Divine Mother. This probably would have been the neutral dark song, though it also could have been a contender for the main theme, as it's about Shadow just wanting to be alone, by himself, with no one to tell him what to do. It also features the word shit in the song, which definitely would have bumped the game's E10 Plus rating to a T in no time. The final song was done by Magnify, and it's my personal favorite out of the unused tracks. It's called Who I Am. Some speculate this was the original main theme of the game, but I honestly believe it was intended to be the final boss theme, like What I'm Made Of was for Sonic Heroes, as Who I Am sounds like Shadow addressing Black Doom and destroying the evils tied to his past so he can finally move on. In fact, there is a clip on YouTube that shows the song injected into the final boss. In conclusion, the music is fantastic. There's definitely not as much variety in the genre like past Sonic games, but it still sounds great. The vocal tracks are probably the best the franchise has ever had, with Chosen One competing to be one of the best Sonic songs of all time in my opinion. They all tie into the story and Shadow as a character beautifully, and I can only give praise, except to maybe Almost Dead, which sounds a bit too try-hard. But that's a perfect way to move on into our next section of this video.
If there's one thing about this game to simultaneously love and hate, it's that the game is written with a tone that is drastically darker than other Sonic games. The presentation for this game is dark and serious at points, but often has lighthearted and self-aware moments familiar to the Sonic franchise that I will get to as well. Before that, I wish to talk more about this game's presentation. Sonic was evolving, as were other franchises in the jump to 3D. Games were becoming more ambitious and taking advantage of the characters that developed over time to make way for bigger things in bigger games, like story. Games like Ratchet & Clank, Jak, Psychonauts, Rayman, and even Pac-Man were getting this edition. But while the story is good, some franchises like Jak and Ratchet tried putting emotion and themes into stories as well. Sonic did the same. The adventure games were on a path to having deeper stories compared to the classic Beat Eggman plot, and really wanted to invest players with stories they told by giving a message, or having themes, or building characters. Characters like Tails, Amy, and Knuckles were no longer one-dimensional supporting figures in Sonic, but they had their own arcs and continuity that really made players become fans of them. Shadow really shows this later in the game. Shadow the Hedgehog as a game is the most we've ever seen a character grow and have themes explored in Sonic, arguably more than Sonic Adventure 2. Shadow's themes explore self-worth, self-acceptance, the individual versus the truth, the individual versus society, prejudice, the past not defining who you are, and seeing the good in people despite the wrong in the world. Arguably better than with Amy in Sonic Adventure 2 in the final story. I already went over examples of some of the themes in this video, but I will be showing examples of the ones I haven't touched on further into my analysis. The trend within the themes is a personal relation to Shadow, and that comes from playing the different story paths and gaining perspectives that you weren't already aware of. Yes, Shadow already has his established character traits that were safe from his amnesia, but the memory loss was a great way to execute the design and writing as it works beautifully within the theme set up for the story. You relate to Shadow in that you're finding answers and drawing your own conclusions on the characters and value of the world around you, and I really have never seen design and writing choices like this since arguably Undertale. Jokingly, I say this game really makes you feel like you're Shadow the Hedgehog. This brings us to a point in the video that is probably the second biggest reason why I made this video, the tone. A majority of the game is not as quote-unquote edgy as one may chalk it up to be online. The sheer amount of criticism this game gets for being too deep for you or being an emo's wet dream are insanely hyperbolic. It's even gotten to the point where Sega's marketing team and the current cast themselves dunk on this game for its first impressions that wrongly define it, as it's gotten so bad that I believe Kirk Thornton is actively doing damage to Shadow's character as he sees the character as the stereotype that the internet has made him out to be. And to that, I consider criticism of the game and the characters for showing off mature content be some of the worst examples of judging a book by its cover in all of gaming history. Seriously. I, and probably many others, are so sick of the word edgy when it comes to Shadow, when that's not at all what he's all about. As I make note of this does not defend the fact that this game was marketed and highlighted poorly. I guarantee that if the surface level appeal of the game was toned down slightly, like reimagining the opening sequence, giving the default select gun sound effect that I refrained from talking about until now, different sounds, and giving the box art of the game a different look, that critics and audiences alike would have been 25%, maybe a little more positive towards the game. I would bet on this alternate timeline. Parts of the game's opening cinematic are clear attempts at trying too hard to reel in fans for a more serious adventure. Heck, Sonic in no part of the game's story was ever outright shot or killed within a city. The scene in the opening is bait, and bad bait at that. Shadow did not need to be as mature as it self-consciously tried to be, considering it was done better before in previous games. Sonic Adventure 2 had the same mix of lightheartedness, drama, and dark subjects that is present in Shadow, and it didn't need to advertise that it had any of these things. Adjustments should have been made to make this game both familiar and new with the tone it gave us. There is one thing that I want to get out of the way right now, the cursing. Damn. I'm not a fan of it either. I feel it's unnecessary, and I will agree that it was a way to push some kind of idea that this game was meant for an older audience, which is a laughable attempt at reeling that demographic in. Despite it being in the game, every time Shadow dies, it rarely pops up unless it's in a cutscene, and ironically, it only feels weird when Shadow himself says it. I could see the Commander or even Espio or Knuckles saying it, but I feel that whenever Shadow says it, it felt forced. Even though some characters feel more natural saying it, it does not make it acceptable for the series. Moving on. My point through all of this is that, despite two traits attached to the game, these two relatively small details are magnified and amplified by everyone when this game comes up. These two things are reasons that the rest of the game's story and our writing should be considered bad. Well, as one criticizer of Star Wars The Last Jedi once said, there is such thing as objective value to content. It sits comfortably alongside subjective value. These things are two different things. While Mahler was arguing how people who loved one thing about a piece of media did not objectively make the media great due to a bigger part of the piece being awful, I am arguing that smaller parts of a bigger picture does not make the media objectively bad. To borrow once again from his example, you hate the pathetic attempts at being dark? That's nice, I don't like them either, but the game has great moments and developments for Shadow and other characters alongside the mechanics and design that make it stand out from the rest of the franchise in a great fashion, meaning that your value that you have defined from the game itself is simply for you. You're not looking at the full extent of what the game has to offer, once again judging a book by its cover. Now, with all this said, the writing in the game has been mixed for people. A majority will magnify the attempts at being mature and label the game horribly written. Well, allow me to retort. When Shadow isn't putting out vague exposition and getting slowed by the interactions with Sonic and other characters, the game makes you reflect on your progression within the story, depending on whatever path you choose. Events and what routes lead you to what level makes sense no matter where you go, during each event being easy to connect to a previous or potential one. Sometimes an event in one path you choose would make you rethink what you've been doing, and make you wonder if you should switch paths. A perfect example of this is seeing Eggman within Sky Troops, and thinking maybe you should look into his perspective on what Shadow's past is, especially since Shadow tried to do this in Heroes and failed before. Another is seeing some of the semi-hero or semi-dark routes, which make Shadow question if he's even allowed to live due to the pain he's unknowingly caused, or if his past is even relevant to the future he can make for himself. Critics will say this game's writing is a throwaway attempt at making Shadow rediscover his past or be less boring, but it's really to dissect Shadow as a character. To say that they never cared about Shadow's character in this game is preposterous. Takashi Iizuka, the lead writer for both Adventure 2 and Heroes, returns for this game, and after the care that he gave Shadow in Adventure 2, he did his absolute best to not betray what Shadow was in the first place, and expand upon things we may have known or not known about him. There is genuine care for this character in this game. The surface level edge is an indicative of what Shadow is all about, but it's sadly what people associate him with the most. But, I can hear you say, Sonic 06 was written poorly. How can you say there was any care for the writing in that? Sonic 06 could have been an amazing game narratively if it was given about 1.5 years more development time. The point is that Sonic 06 was confirmed to be rushed for a holiday release, and there is no hard proof out there to claim Shadow was, aside from the detractors inventing this claim to justify their gripes with the plot and writing. Also, Shadow was objectively the best written character in Sonic 06, so this argument falls apart immediately. Sega knew that people liked Shadow, and they wanted to do their best to handle him for a future. Shadow himself, in his own game, was probably written the best way he will ever be for a long time. Obviously, his peak was in Adventure 2, but his own game was a great contender for his best role as well. He's a focused, determined, but confused individual with several inner conflicts driving him to whatever path he goes down, as this is helped by the information whatever character feeds him through a playthrough. He has his smart remarks here and there, and his reactions to the events and familiar names and places all feel genuine, aside from bad deliveries from Jason Griffith on some occasions. Which, I should add, Jason did a fantastic job as Shadow, as this is the first time he'd be voicing him in the video games. Unfortunately, when it comes to translating the writing of the game from Japanese to English, it could have been done better, but I don't fault Jason for that. I fault the dubbing process, but we'll get to that later. While Shadow keeps an open mind on what plot-important characters tell him, since he can always come to his own conclusions for what his purpose is, his main goal is simple: get the Chaos Emeralds and find out who he really is. During the story paths, Shadow starts to look away from himself and his goals, and either opens up to other established characters or starts to trust them, and comes to learn about the world and its people he's never experienced for over 50 years of his existence. He treats every objective and character, for the most part, with serious business, but is prone to show sympathy, loyalty, nihilism, a sense of justice, or brutality with more exposure to others around him. Shadow also retains some of the cockiness he was known for in Adventure 2, In one case, where Shadow entered Circus Park and saw Tails with a Chaos Emerald he's been looking for, he proclaims, "This is just too easy." Now, yes, you can take the Emerald from Tails and take the neutral route, but Shadow also helps Tails and has the Emerald just given to him anyways. This builds his trust in Sonic and his friends, since he's helped them out and they're willing to help him out. Remember, he doesn't know anything before his reawakening in Sonic Heroes, so he's essentially a blank slate when it comes to meeting and regrouping with characters that have already known him. He's familiar with them, but definitely not chummy at this point. He's, dare I say, almost like a custom character, due to the way Shadow has technically never gotten to know anyone around him. He just goes with the flow of whatever happens around him, and he probably has an honest reaction to some of the characters than the OC from Sonic Forces had. Sonic irritates him like he's supposed to know their history, and Black Doom can get to Shadow as well if Doom makes an early claim that Shadow should have been subservient. After all, Doom had just met Shadow, and Shadow hasn't taken any orders from as long as he can remember, even with Rouge and Omega, who he just saw as temporary partners. This game is very well known for its early mentioned endings, and while the 10 regular ones aren't canon, they give us a deeper understanding of what Shadow could have been if he wasn't given his entire background and ultimate purpose for existence in the final story. The difference with these endings, though, is that Shadow makes his own purpose in life without finding out the truth about why he was created, like how he found out in The Last Way. Shadow could have seen humanity as jealous and scared weaklings that wanted him dead because of his immense power, and Black Doom feeding Shadow information carefully would have made him want to put humanity in their place for all they've done to him. While being around Sonic and his friends, Shadow could have realized that he has friends in this world who want to not only help him, but the world around them that they love, which helps remind him of his promise to Maria once again, and leads him down a path of protecting the Earth. The best hypothetical endings, though, are the ones where Shadow is fed with this kind of information, but thinks completely about himself, within the both pure dark path choosing the hero ending, and the pure hero path choosing the dark ending. In the pure dark path, Shadow is convinced that humanity is a disease, but he sees that he should double-cross and usurp Black Doom since he sees himself as more fit conqueror of the universe. This leads to a fight with Black Doom that ends in Shadow proclaiming he will rule the universe with no one to stop him. A very interesting what-if scenario. The Pure Hero Dark Path has Shadow activate the shields on the Black Comet. Shadow, at this point, knows the Black Arms are losing and sees this as a perfect opportunity to beat Sonic with them, killing two birds with one stone. Shadow then fights the Commander and Sonic, beats them, and proclaims himself as the most powerful and perfect hedgehog in existence. A very cheesy and over-the-top ending that feels out of place within the overall path Shadow would have chose, but definitely feels logical with how arrogant and egotistical Shadow can be, with his status being the ultimate life form. Sonic, compared to the other characters in the story, has either been a hindrance, a distraction, or an overall annoyance to Shadow's progression. And although Shadow can agree with Sonic on what should be done, Sonic always tries to tease him or one-up him constantly, and it aligns well with what he's come to know about himself and others down his journey for identity. And while the game obviously has its moments for being either too try-hard or too much of a mood killer through Sonic's allies, I would like to talk about something I never really thought about before. Once again, bringing up a point mentioned in the Geek Critique, I am certain there was a very dry, intentional self-awareness within this game. In a game where you wield alien warfare and then a Billy Hatcher vacuum weapon 35 seconds later, you will have a scene like this.
This is like taking candy from a baby, which is fine by me.
And a scene like this in the same game.
Finally, justice is served!
If what you say is true, then I will respectfully accept my fate.
You mean to tell me that you really don't remember a thing?
But I just need some time to uncover the real truth.
If you want further proof of the self-awareness present within the game, the characters that are related to Sonic's alignment are way too cheerful and upbeat compared to the tone that people like Eggman or Black Doom set for each story path you go down. And I firmly believe they were intentionally written this way. Shadow the Hedgehog was actually meant to be a spin-off series, where this game would kick off a plethora of games to capitalize on the popularity of Shadow. And while this game exists for getting the ball running, the goal was also to give Shadow back the development he had at the end of Sonic Adventure 2. Sonic and friends contrasting with the tone of the game's set was to remind veterans of the series that it can be lighthearted and fun no matter how dark it can get. Aside from the opening cutscene, which is a bit much like I explained, I believe that the game knows where to take itself seriously and when to give you a chuckle at how ridiculous it can be. And once again, it's all dependent on which story path you go down. Something to both praise and critique this game for is its villains. 3 villains in particular being Black Doom, the Commander, and Eggman. Eggman, for the most part, is fine. It's kind of cool to see his way of dealing with a global threat like the Black Arms. Allying with him also gives us some nice conversations that either made me chuckle or interested in seeing Eggman's involvements in the Black Arm invasion. The Commander, who we will talk about later in the Last Way segment, is an intense military leader who basically controls Gun. He has a past with Shadow that is explained in parts of the story, and is a good character to show us how Shadow, even though he's done the right thing on occasion, still can't be trusted and could be more than meets the eye with how little the world knows about him. He's serious and paranoid about Shadow, with a burning passion for revenge that can only be amplified by the invasion of Earth. He eventually confronts Shadow and explains to him about the witnessing of his creation, his connection to the black aliens, and how he's responsible for the death of his family and innocent civilians aboard the Ark, including Maria. While Shadow feels responsible even though he can't remember, and none of this is his fault, his worldview changed with this conversation because he realizes he's not the only one in the world that suffers, and by focusing on himself, he may have caused more suffering or was selfish in trying to fix the problems that were small compared to the plights of others. This leads to either Shadow accepting the half-truths about him and admitting his creation as a whole was a mistake, or looking at his title as the ultimate life form as a responsibility to ensure no one uses him or the Ark for their own desire again, even going as far as sparing Eggman in the ending you reach him in. The game should have used more of him. He definitely brought potential to the table for more looks into Shadow as a character. The only complaint I really have with him is his American voice actor, Mark Thompson. He's done great work before. One role I'm most familiar with him being Casey Jones from the 2003 iteration of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But in this game, his delivery feels a bit hammy.
You have a nice place here. I think that I'll take it.
Yeah? Well, baseball's in season, and so are you freaking weirdo! Batter up! It's not ready yet!
I don't care! We have no other option! We must protect the President and the Chaos Emeralds at all costs!
Finally, Black Doom. Aside from his voice, which is Sean Schemmel of Dragon Ball Z fame just doing a super try-hard Shockmaster voice, he has a very interesting design and seems to be intimidating with every interaction you have. With his clothing showing off what looks like a black alb with gold and jewels attached to him, he's akin to some kind of occult religious leader who rattles on about the superiority of his kind and acts almost like he's a divine presence. He plays a lot with Shadow's relationship with the people of Earth and the planet itself, playing into the theme of an individual versus society, as he often evokes memories that Shadow once had to sway him towards a hatred for the people around him. He even tries to manipulate certain memories and put his own pieces of the story in them so that they aren't how Shadow initially remembered them. While he's very sinister and is written great in certain parts of the game, often swaying Shadow to a path of conquest within the Black Arms, he does tend to fall apart in certain hero endings, and comes off as a very cartoonish villain in the Last Way. He's no Mephiles, but he's also no Zavok either. He's a good evil force for Shadow to interact with, especially since he's almost like a father to Shadow in extent, and being voiced by Sean Schemmel, voice of Goku, I guess that makes him Goku Black Doom? I'm sorry. Aside from the villains, almost every past character from the past 2 adventure games show up, and they tend to act how they should coming over from the previous 3D games. Despite the thoroughly dark tone, they're placed within the story well enough to keep the narrative naturally going and react to things appropriately in certain cutscenes they may appear in. However, there are certain characters that just won't shut up. Eggman and his boss fights are a prime example of this.
You know what they say, the more the merrier. You know what they say, the more the merrier. You know what they say, the more the merrier.
I mean, to be fair, Eggman did this in Adventure as well. But I think the problem is that, in Shadow's case, it's the only thing he says. If there was more variety to his voice lines, I'm sure these bosses would have been more meme-worthy like their older brothers. And, like I mentioned earlier, some of the characters related to the missions can be awfully annoying as well. It certainly isn't as bad as the constant barrage of quotes coming from Sonic heroes, but it still can be annoying to hear. Some spouting off stuff you really don't need to hear for the 3rd time in a row. But with these valid yet small complaints in mind, it leads me to something I've thought of when dissecting this game. Looking at the way characters occasionally act, how ridiculous the weapons and dialogue can be, and how the game tried to overcompensate for more mature themes, I actually think this game came out at the wrong time. This game would have been dubbed a classic within what fans have called the meta era of Sonic. Shadow, shown in this game, Adventure 2, very briefly in Heroes and even sometimes in 06, is usually reserved, but shows a bit of his pride in being the ultimate life form with a scoff, or a playful comment when people challenge him. When I think of how this game could have gotten a sequel that could have improved from its reception it got, while also not changing the core of what it tried to be, I often think of a joke from the Sonic Shorts collection.
You may have an idea there.
All jokes aside, I think what Sega should have done is made the obvious attempts at humor in Shadow a little more apparent. The obnoxious but silly interactions with other supporting characters could have been tweaked to help the appeal of this approach as well. Also, if you happen to up his cocky and arrogant nature seen in Adventure 2 and in this game, a hypothetical sequel would have been the perfect opportunity to show off Sega's take on something like Raiden or Dante. Wait. I digress. Shadow and his game are consistently written next to both Adventure 2 and Heroes. The problem comes up when people start to get sucked into the atmosphere of certain storylines or conversations that he had in the game and don't realize there's a moment for laughs due to how dry it is. Then again, playing this game way older than when I first played it, I can't believe some people never caught on to what Sega was trying to do. There was literally a scene where Shadow karate chops a keyboard after Team Chaotix asked for his help in hacking into Eggman's computer, and suddenly, Shadow was in. To get off this topic, my main point is that while the game's attempts at being over the top and hinting at being ironic could have been played up more, the game's writing is good and really great when it comes to parts you're meant to reflect on, like when Shadow contemplates on how the world would have seen him as a threat just on his existence, and when he learns the reason behind his existence in the final ending. But there's one last thing I am going to address within the writing. Shadow compared to where he started, and Shadow in this game. Shadow has been a difficult character to define within the Sonic universe for various reasons, mainly due to the narrative and character traits he's given clashing with the surface value opinions about him being thrown in and assumed as part of his character, with some of these opinions being the earliest form of stereotyping within the Sonic fandom. While there are huge fans of Shadow himself, myself included, I see so many people get his character wrong based on a casual level and fan level, and it's honestly really sad. Many detractors of this game state Shadow is a completely different person than he was in Adventure 2, which just isn't the truth, and I'm going to give 2 examples of the more vocal arguments about Shadow's character in this game, alongside an explanation of why these statements fall apart. Number 1. Shadow was misguided and didn't understand Maria's promise until the end of Sonic Adventure 2. You can say that Shadow remembered what Maria wanted, but he certainly was not misguided. Shadow was bitter and hateful towards all of humanity in Adventure 2, so much to the point that he wanted to end everything, even his own existence. But he put aside his feelings towards humanity's wrongdoings and kept his original promise to Maria because he loved her. Even when he kept his promise to her, he still wondered during his at-the-time death if this is what she really wanted. After all humanity did to him, he still sacrificed himself for the sake of a person's promise. It wasn't until this game that Shadow was not only given the memory of his promise back, but was given a different purpose in life and reason to defend the world through Gerald's message at the end of the game. Gerald explained that he was at fault for the carnage he would cause to both his life and the world, but told Shadow that he was to protect the world where Gerald failed. Shadow's purpose in life is not the only thing that keeps him going. He does what he does for 2 people he was closest to, and finds good in the people that he hated. But you cannot tell me that Shadow was misguided and flipped like a switch and would care for humanity if he was told to. That takes development for him, and it's a big part of this game's story with Shadow, especially when he talks to characters like Black Doom and the Commander. Also, let's reverse the roles for a second. Even if Gerald was given the same promise to Maria before her death, I'm sure his relationship towards humanity would absolutely still be in a bad place, insane or not. Number 2. Shadow's personality and character arc was destroyed in this game. What? How? Do you not remember that this Shadow has amnesia? If anything, his character arc wasn't destroyed, but reset. And he's even more complete of a person by the end of this game than Adventure 2 thanks to all the knowledge he's been given about his life and the lives of others. Just because his character arc is reset doesn't mean he as a character was changed. I am very aware that amnesia in storytelling is a delicate plot device and can either be handled horribly or fine if given a set amount of rules by the story to follow. But for the most part, Shadow's character is the same as to how he was in the beginning of Adventure 2. He has less knowledge of his past in this game compared to Adventure 2, but his initial resentment for humanity is there, along with the arrogance and his cockiness. They clearly state at the beginning of the game all that he can remember, so there isn't any consistency issue that I can think of when it comes to his character. But wait! He saved Rouge at the beginning of Sonic Heroes, then called humanity pathetic in this game. While Rouge could have handled herself off on her own, she was caught off guard in this moment, and Shadow saved her due to her defenselessness in the way of gunfire. A trigger that probably shocked and reminded him of Maria's death, much like how the alarms on Sonic's ship gave him a flashback of the Ark's artificial chaos emergency. Like I said before in this video, Shadow has every right to think humanity is pathetic and barbaric if they downright kill the defenseless. So him taking action in a scene he's familiar with is only fighting what he despises. Also, while this doesn't really matter to much in the argument, a thing to remember is that Rouge isn't a human. Omega, on the other hand, was a human creation with weapons Shadow was slightly familiar with. Shadow having amnesia is fine for how it's handled in this game. They made sure not to give him too many details at the beginning of the game so that the plot and story they wanted to tell would work. Heroes' plot and lack of development for Shadow also helped this game begin smoothly. Shadow could have been fine not knowing his past in Heroes, but after seeing the Shadow androids during the game, he obviously would still have some unanswered questions within his mind. My main point is, if you want to blame the game for giving Shadow amnesia, you're blaming the wrong game. Blame Heroes for resurrecting him and making up a reason for him to side with Rouge and Omega. They might as well have resurrected Gamma as a rebooted, refurbished robot than Eggman would have expected to exceed expectations, but go through the same arc he did in Adventure 1. Then again, I would love to see a Gamma spin-off game the more I think about it. Well, I believe I've said enough on this game as a whole. I've covered every kind of detail and subject that you can bring attention to, and now I think it's time to wrap up all of this and go into the final story path, The Last Way. So, you've successfully looked into every possible way Shadow can go about his life and what events could change his purpose completely. Now it's time to do what you set out to do in the first place. Return the 7 Chaos Emeralds as promised. The Last Way, which is the final story segment of the game, is basically a culmination of everything that could have happened within the game. Obviously, the 10 endings were what-if scenarios, and while some may go right ahead and deem the game completely meaningless with how many endings and story threads they had behind them, this is not true. The events that happened within all 10 different possible storylines merged together to form The Last Way. Obviously, things like Shadow fighting Sonic and the Commander, Shadow defeating Black Doom early, or Shadow killing Eggman probably didn't make it into the melting pot of the events culminating into The Last Way. And before we dive completely into the final story segment of the game, I want to address another criticism that I see tossed around whenever this game is brought up. And that's something I wanted to mention within the story section of this video, but wanted to wait until we got to The Last Way, and that is the plot's consistency. Shadow has a ton of information in his head from all kinds of experiences getting these emeralds. From context-sensitive flashbacks when met with a familiar location to conversations with old and new characters. This game definitely does not have a very linear story, but the information he's received could have been in any order interchangeably, as it would have given us the ending either way. We have a solid beginning and end to the game, but it's up to us to basically create a middle for Shadow so that once we get to The Last Way, it all makes sense. This may sound confusing, but it really isn't if you take the endings to each pathway out. While both the emeralds and the characters may have been in different parts of the story, the events would have gone on as told. Let me explain. While Shadow did not use the Ark to obliterate Central City, the President was still seen to have evacuated into the Gun Fortress. Shadow would eventually get all 7 emeralds and was still probably told that humanity hates him by Black Doom. But at the same time, he probably had intense flashbacks and recollections of his past with Maria on the Ark, or was conflicted with his allegiance to the Black Arms due to Sonic and his friends accepting him as an ally, especially since those allies like Rouge and Omega helped him in Sonic Heroes. After all, at this point, they have value to Shadow in his quest for knowledge of his past, and they seem to genuinely care for his well-being. All these events and pieces of information are confirmed to have happened prior to The Last Way, with us hearing various voices from different subplots within the game during the first cutscene of The Last Way. I will be touching more on this topic later, as this all causes a glaring problem with the climax of the plot of the game as a whole, which brings us to our next topic of discussion. One thing I see being mentioned is that some of the plot points within this game make either no sense later in the story, or the game suffers from what people call plot holes. Do not get me wrong though, plot holes exist in this game, and there is a catastrophically bad one that we will cover in a bit. They are present in each Sonic game, in every era of the series, even the good ones. Examples include, how did Gerald alter the mind of both the Bio-Lizard and Shadow after being in Gun's captivity? How did Metal Sonic even become Neo-Metal Sonic? Where is the Master Emerald during the time Knuckles is in numerous games away from Angel Island, and who is protecting it? How did Princess Elise have the Blue Chaos Emerald her whole life, if we've seen it multiple times? These are only a few within the series, but that is not an excuse at all when it comes to this game. The described plot holes that are spoken up about when criticizing this game that I am more concerned with are the events that flow within the narrative for each path. Some have regarded the instantaneous changes that Shadow can make within his moral paths as plot holes, when really, looking at each level, especially the ones that end each path, I can't see any mission that would be considered illogical. Most missions within an emerald tied to them have you collect an emerald regardless of what path you decide to take. It's just more or less effort to get the emerald, deciding on what you want to do. The characters associated with each morality option recognize Shadow, and in his eyes, this would lead him to learning more about himself. But then again, maybe he decides that getting every emerald as fast as possible is the quickest way to find out who he is, like he stated in the first cutscene. I just find the term plot hole to be out of place when defining some of the problems people have with the plot. Yes, some characters appear only once in the story and never return, but that doesn't mean that they become plot holes the entire story of the game. The commander may only show up within the first cutscene if your decided story path, but the threat of Shadow to Gun is established. This gives us logic as to why Gun would be after Shadow for his decisions or his origins, android or not, and why he would be choosing dark missions. An example of a plot hole that people could bring up, but never do, is how the moon is still intact after Eggman destroyed it in Adventure 2, since that would be considered an impossibility, or how the president got a photo of both Sonic and Shadow together, or how Prison Island is still somewhat around even though it was heavily damaged by Eggman in Adventure 2. Characters appearing only once in a section part of a bigger story is not a plot hole, it's just a piece of a bigger story. Are there certain things that I wish were given more context? Absolutely. The commander, who is seen as an antagonist to Shadow the entire game, should have been given more attention to detail, since it's explained that his family lived on the Ark while Shadow was being created. We're never given any information as to why his family was there, and while I would argue that it would be nice information to have, it seems to be irrelevant to his role in the story. The main thing he believes is that Shadow is the cause of everything that has gone on in his story, from the death of Maria and almost everyone aboard the Ark 50 years ago, to the Black Arms invasion, and two important revelations that the commander receives is that Shadow did not mean for any of what has occurred to happen, since he was unaware of how much he unintentionally caused, and that Gerald Robotnik was never hell-bent on destroying humanity in the first place, but rather wanted to protect humanity through his ultimate creation. A part of the story that would be considered a legitimate plot hole is the lack of information we are given on Team Chaotix's role in the story. The entire time they are trying to gather information surrounding Eggman, Gerald Robotnik, and Project Shadow in general. They were tasked by Gun to do all of this, but it's never explained what exactly they were trying to accomplish. Were they trying to activate the Eclipse Cannon to destroy the Black Comet? Were they trying to find a secret weakness to the Black Arms in Gerald's research? Either way, they feel shoehorned to be relevant in the final story since they activate a message intended for Shadow within the top secret discs found in Prison Island. And since they were using the main computer room on board the Ark, the message was broadcasted all across the world, similar to Gerald's final message of revenge in Adventure 2. Now, this is a great way of giving Shadow the clearest truth possible about his past, but with how accidental it felt and how little of context we have on Team Chaotix's main mission, it seems to raise more questions. These are all problems within the plot that are relatively minor and insignificant compared to the major problem within the entirety of the story that we are about to tackle. So far, this game has had okay to great writing and story paths that come together nicely depending on whatever objective you wish to follow. Each self-contained story works great on their own, but the biggest, most fatal issue in the entire plot arises when it comes to the story's canon. As mentioned earlier, this game does not have a linear story when looking at it as a whole. A major part of this game was to connect the dots within parts of the story and form Shadow's identity by looking at each perspective. And it's quite impressive to see so many different story beats interchangeably mesh with one another no matter what mission Shadow completes. While Shadow's amnesia gives us a great way to show off themes and have a character study on the protagonist for each story path, this is not an excuse to throw away connectivity story. It's fine to come up with your own conclusions to everything on the table, but not telling the audience how we got to where we are, especially a critical part of the story like the climax, is an example of bad writing in a game with relatively well-connected independent story paths. We know the events of the game happen due to a sequence of voices we hear in Shadow's head during the last way, but the simple question is how? That can break immersion if we really think about it, because the Chaos Emeralds were in all different locations in different story paths. Where were they canonically, and what events led to Shadow experiencing everything at the same time? gaining all of the perspectives that we know, and not just through one playthrough, what happened? This is something that is never answered, and it still boggles a lot of people today. The fact that we have to piece the events of the story together is a major issue and is borderline inexcusable. This kind of continuity error is never seen in a Sonic game before, aside from maybe the Master Emerald being in different spots during the ending of Sonic 3 and Knuckles, where the Master Emerald was in possession of Mecha Sonic and Eggman at the same time. Regardless of all this, the major events in the game still happened within the exceptions of the hypothetical final boss battles and ending in each story path, but it's so distracting that it begs for answers. Luckily, some fans have tried to piece together a good answer for what the canon chain of events were that led to The Last Way, and I recommend Godzilla 3 Shadow Full Canon Story, which is a great video that tries to hit every important story beat until The Last Way. Aside from these glaring issues, The Last Way ties up every character's journey within the game, and it does its best to answer most of the old and new questions raised in Shadow's story. Some are concluded rather well, but others are admittedly rushed and inappropriate placed in almost impossible situations. One of these questions that was sloppily answered was the very interesting Neutral Routes storyline, where Shadow questions if he is a copy of the original Shadow, or if he really is the ultimate life form. You would think that this would be a very important thing to answer, considering that it was a major question placed on Shadow in two different story paths. However, this answer is only given by a short voice clip from Eggman during the final boss if you waited 10 minutes into the fight. Eggman tells you that Shadow was rescued by one of his robots, alluded to be Omega, after Shadow fell from exhaustion, saving the world from final hazard. Shadow's memory is lost due to the impact he dealt with falling into the Earth, and while Eggman had Shadow in captivity, he used his time to study Shadow and tried to make an android army in his likeness for his own scheme, keeping the real Shadow hidden for as long as he wanted. This plot point is extremely fascinating, but it is only given a short amount of time to be explained in a final boss that can be killed in less than half the time this voice clip is expected to pop up in. I understand that Sega wanted to tie up everything as neatly as they could, but something like this could have been used for good speculation on Shadow as a character, or used as an interesting sequel idea if it was ever possible. I don't know why this plot point is answered so absurdly, and I do consider this as a valid critique of the game's story, since it was something that could have been executed way better. With all that taken care of, let's take a moment to talk about the climax of the game's story. So, while Shadow hopes for the entire truth of his past to be uncovered, Sonic and his friends show up and shake his confidence in getting the truth, since it turns out he was being used the entire time. Shadow is ultimately betrayed by Black Doom, as Doom uses the Chaos Emeralds to bring the Black Comet down to Earth, as it leaches onto Earth for energy. Black Doom was never interested in giving Shadow an explanation of his past. Shadow only assumed that giving Black Doom the emeralds would fit everything into place, since Doom seemed to mysteriously know more about him than any of his past acquaintances. Rouge and Eggman may have known more about him, and could have given him a refresher of just who he was, but we know that Eggman has his own gains by keeping Shadow's true identity a secret, and Rouge only knew so much aside from the classified government files and an insane Gerald Robotnik's ramblings about releasing Shadow to destroy the world. So, depending on Black Doom for answers, Shadow is ripped from his hopes of knowing his past once again, since Doom used him as a way to fulfill Gerald Robotnik's promise of getting the Chaos Emeralds, a promise made in exchange for Doom helping Gerald during his work on Project Shadow. Shadow is distraught at this revelation that he's been a pawn almost his whole life, as well as Eggman dealing with the fact that what he questioned in the credits of Adventure 2, being that his grandfather did wish to destroy all humanity, turned out to be true. But this doesn't stop Sonic and his friends, as they are about to attack Black Doom but are frozen by a gas that paralyzes non-Black Arm's life forms. Doom releases leeches to devour our heroes, but Shadow taps into his Black Arm's blood and breaks free of the gas. After thinking about all he's gone through and all of the memories that have haunted him, he cannot accept that his purpose was to be used and tossed away by Black Doom and Gerald. He proclaims that he's put the past behind him and will defeat Black Doom here and now, giving chase to the Black Arms leader, starting the final mission of the game. Oh, and I guess this is another plot hole that I can't even explain. Shadow just leaves Sonic and the others to be eaten by the leeches. Somehow they break free and start communicating with Shadow as he chases Black Doom, but it's never explained how they do this. Oh well, I guess I'm not immersed anymore, guys. Yep. Anyways, the final level is a remix of past stages combined together like Final Haunt and Black Comet, with some of the toughest enemies in the game halting your progress. You're given a very gracious timer to get to the end of the stage, but there's a twist. You actually have to use your Chaos Control to speed through the level when it's impossible to move forward. This, for a final level compared to something like Cannon's Core, is pretty weak. Cannon's Core made use of putting everything you've learned throughout the game, from its mechanics and environments, with a challenging level design and pressure-inducing limited time. This, however, feels more or less like an average end path level, with just a timer and a few necessary uses of your chargeable attacks. While, yes, you are putting most of your abilities to use, it could have been a lot more challenging with less time, and more variety from past levels. Why not add a Black Comet-themed security camera section, or a railgun section with more challenging enemies to watch out for? Or how about making use of the vehicles we use besides the flying Black Arms creature? The level, while having good music and added tension with the characters rooting you on, feels dull in execution. It could have been a lot more, but it still serves as a fine build-up to the final confrontation. As you finish the level, Black Doom spouts out pretty much generic, over-the-top dialogue that clashes with his more ominous appearance in the early parts of the game, and Shadow probably delivers one of his best lines in the series.
I've heard enough.
You're boring me to death, Black Doom. You're going down.
Shadow is stunted once again by his progression by Black Doom, controlling his body through Black Arm's blood, which leads Shadow to helplessly collapse on the ground. Meanwhile, Team Chaotix is seen messing within the Ark's computer room amid the chaos on Earth, and finally gets a message out to Earth that plays everywhere, much like the messages in Adventure 2. The message, seemingly one made by Gerald after Shadow's creation with the help of the Black Arms, and him learning the government has decided to shut down the Ark, tells Shadow his real purpose, how he was made to benefit humanity, to be the best thing he could give to the world, and in making sure this wouldn't be lost, developed the Eclipse Cannon to destroy the Black Comet and the Black Arms once they arrived back on Earth. Before the message ends, Gerald tells Shadow one last time how much he means to him, and in a part that pulls on Shadow's heart, Maria comes on screen to ensure her grandfather that her and Shadow will make sure nothing bad happens, while acknowledging Shadow directly.
Shadow, you are the only hope to save mankind as we know it. The future of this planet depends on you.
Don't worry, Grandfather. Shadow and I will protect this planet. Right, Shadow?
As Black Doom laughs at this attempt at outsmarting him, he's shocked by Shadow resisting Doom's influence, and assures Doom that he will be taken care of with everything he needs to know about his past, now a part of him.
You have no control over me, Black Doom. I now understand why I am here. I made a promise and I'm here to keep it. Today, I put my past behind me.
Doom teleports away and telepathically threatens him as he uses the power of the Emeralds to transform into his true form to ensure the Black Arm's dominance over the planet, while Shadow transforms into Super Shadow with probably the coolest callback to a Sonic game I've listened to. The final boss, Devil Doom, is a pretty great final boss. giving much more mobility to a 3D Sonic final boss that we've had before. With Perfect Chaos, it just felt like a boost segment with obstacles. With Final Hazard, it felt like the same thing, but with a weird directional system and timer. And with Metal Overlord, no, it's just a button masher. Super Shadow has the ability to shoot Chaos Spears, stop time, gather rings from meteors and balloons around the arena, and it feels like an actual fight between two different supercharged beings rather than a struggle to keep one away from another. I will say again, Who I Am would have been a better song to use for this battle, but I Am All of Me is iconic and still harbors a lot of dripping hatred that Shadow may have for Doom and the Black Arms, while the lyrics assure him of his confidence in who he is now. After the fight, Sega decides to give us the most metal ending to a Sonic game you can make. Shadow stands atop a defeated Black Comet with the resources of the Black Arms inside, and musters all the strength he has to chaos control the entire comet outside of Earth's orbit, as the Eclipse Cannon activates and blows up the entire comet. The Earth heralds Shadow as a hero, with Sonic and his friends are safe outside the comet, and commends Shadow for his work, with comic relief as well. The commander sulks in guilt for labeling Shadow and Gerald as villains, while the president feels guilt for how the world treated Gerald before his insanity, stating that they should honor Gerald's real legacy and Shadow's heroism. In a final scene, Shadow looks over the Earth on the Ark, the one place he can really call home, a sanctuary to his life and a safe haven from the world around him, and holds up an old photo of Gerald and Maria as he walks away, proclaiming his goodbyes forever to Shadow the Hedgehog. And that is, at the end of the day, the central quote that should be associated with this game. That last line, "Goodbye forever, Shadow the Hedgehog," means more than you think it does. This game, as good or bad as some people say it is, gave Shadow even more depth after Adventure 2. He could have stayed dead in Adventure 2, and I would have been fine with that, but we get a continuation of his story and closure on his conflict since the first game. Even after he sacrificed himself in Adventure 2, he still questioned if this is what Maria wanted. And even though you can say that's looking too deep into his wording, we still got the solid answer for Shadow's purpose in the story of both Sonic and Eggman. Shadow not only is giving the people of Earth the chance to be happy, he wants to protect the world as Gerald and Maria originally hoped for, what he was destined for. And while we knew this as his original arc in Adventure 2, we're given important questions that challenge the reason Shadow has for carrying out his promise. Why would he do what he does for humanity if they are always going to fear him? Would he accept responsibility for the problems he unintentionally caused the world? Would he even care for humanity with how fearful and small they are compared to him? Even going as far as judging him for his past? Or does the compassion and care that he receives from others open his eyes to how good humanity can be, despite their flaws? He has his own way of doing things, sure, but after the short, traumatizing life he's had until now, can you blame him for being how he is? But it doesn't matter now, because he's back to how he should have been after Adventure 2, and is ready to be the hero that Earth deserved. He has so much going for him after this game. He's moving forward from here. He's joined Gun, the organization he once resented, and resented him, to ensure justice is carried out logically and correctly on Earth. How great would it be to see Shadow doing the things Sonic does, with a no-nonsense, intense spin? Well, you all know what came next. Sonic 06 released as a mortal wound to the legacy of the franchise. Yuji Naka left Sonic Team, and every character within Sonic has been reduced to a caricature of how semi-fans see them all. Even though Shadow had the best story in all of 06, that wasn't going to put the flames out that engulfed the trash fire of a game. Shadow was independent and finally moving forward after the arcs he had been through. We saw his relationship with Rouge and Omega, the mutual respect and playful banter with Sonic, and even thought process and dedication towards the world he serves that might turn on him one day. Shadow was interesting, way more than Sonic was at this point to me, and it was disappointing to never see him again in an actual continuation of his story until Sonic Forces. And when I look at the things Sega has done to a character I once related to and loved dearly, I can only sulk, and unfortunately wish that I never saw him again due to the way the franchise has changed to suit its so-called audience. That's the best part about this ending, and why I appreciate this game more than it's actually worth. Because it proves that Shadow isn't what everyone says he is. Shadow is not this edgy, brooding jerk, no matter what IGN, Game Grumps, Team 4-Star, Some Call Me Johnny, or even Sega themselves say. He's not selfish, self-centered, ignorant, resentful, unsympathetic, or uncaring. Shadow was, and is to me, a deep-thinking, dedicated, hurt recluse that only distances himself from people because he knows they won't last, and has trust issues due to the people who have tried to use him for gain. And even when the world would discriminate against him and label him as a threat, he would still fight for them, maybe either to atone for the sins of his own existence, or maybe because he does not know everyone is like that, and one bad person doesn't mean the world is guilty. He wants to ensure that people of Earth don't suffer like he did both 50 years ago and in finding himself. Yeah, he can be prideful at times with his title as the ultimate life form, but deep down, Shadow cherishes the people that genuinely cared for him, and still does despite knowing he might outlive them one day. He holds on to the people that stick with him till the end, whether it's Rouge, Omega, or any other person who sees the good in him. Yes, even Sonic. And honestly, if I was him, I'd probably get sick of Sonic too. Their relationship seems like two people who have the same job. While one is being annoying and teasing the other, the partner just wants to do his job the best he can with no obstacles in his way, and even sees his partner as a delay in his progress, almost like Sonic is too slow? But at the end of the day, they still get the job done, and still respect each other for the help they had on each one's journey. Shadow is almost like the Batman to Sonic's Superman, rather than the Vegeta to his Goku. Both have a strong sense of justice, but serve it differently. But Shadow is not that anymore. No one in the franchise is what they used to be. If you're like me, you probably turned your head to the comics, specifically Sonic Universe, and really enjoyed the continuity that the characters had from their games, shown in the stories never told in the games. Heck, Sonic Universe actually had a sequel story to this game and introduced Shadow's brother. It even gave us a look at how far Shadow had come as a character when it came to protecting life on Earth and honoring Maria's wish. It was so great to see this development again after not having it for so many years. Shadow is how I remembered him in these comics. So is Knuckles and Tails and Amy and even Sonic himself. But Sega has to put their foot down and establish how the characters are without any context.
Saving the world? You? Don't make me laugh. You're weak. And you know what makes you weak? Your loyalty to your pathetic friends.
Shadow the Hedgehog, in conclusion, is the game that ended the era of Sonic that I loved. Dare I say, it was not the first game in the Dark Age. It was the last game before the Dark Age. Researching all I could for this game and analyzing every critique this game has been given down to its music, I often look into the comments of various videos, and it genuinely makes me happy to see that I was not the only one that ended up liking this game, and I think it's a quiet majority. I am even happier to see people view this game as one of their favorites. For the earliest fans of the franchise, I really understand why you would hate Shadow. He's the symbol of Sonic's change to a different generation. Sonic didn't have the same feeling it had in the 90s. I get that now, because now I know what it's like to have your generation forgotten, or even changed to unrecognizability with how the meta era is compared to my era with Sonic. I know how you feel now seeing what you loved about the franchise crumble before you. Sonic was something different to me not only because of characters like Shadow, Chaos, Tikal, Gamma, Maria, and Gerald Robotnik, but because of the stories within the adventure games. If you ever get the chance to play this game again, even if you think you've made your final verdict on the game, please, give it one last shot. It's not a perfect game. There's tons of things that could have been touched on, like some of the mission objectives or the game's length, or even polished characters and story points. It's definitely not one of the titans of the franchise, and I get if you probably still hate it. I get if you still hold your views on the game's elements, or its length and repetition, but you cannot tell me this game was unplayable. You cannot tell me this game doesn't matter to the series. You cannot tell me this game was objectively bad. It did not have the freedom that the controls gave you like in Adventure 1, or the linear and connected story that was presented like in Adventure 2, but it also didn't suffer from the game-breaking glitches like in Sonic Boom or in Sonic 06. It didn't suffer from bland gameplay and level design like in Sonic Forces and in Sonic and the Secret Rings. And it, despite what people say, did not destroy the characters we love. Most importantly, it did not steer away from what 3D Sonic and Sonic was as a whole. Platforming, replayability, and fast reactions that reward a player with momentum and speed. Objectively, as a Sonic game, it's a B-. As a whole, the positives outweigh the negatives. It's good. Could it have been better? Absolutely. To quote the Geek Critique loosely, the adventure games were the price of ambition, which I agree with, especially on this game. Shadow the Hedgehog had its moments with being a chore, and it had its flaws with designs and continuity and with its presentation, but at the core, it was an engaging and fun game with a confusing yet interesting story, and tried new things to improve what we loved about Sonic, from its gameplay and mechanics to character development and style. It pushed the level design to a point to highlight all of 3D Sonic's moments at this point, from different gameplay styles to level structures focused on platforming or speed. It was the last we'll probably ever see from the adventure era's magic, and in the very end it went out with a bittersweet but satisfying bang. But as for Sega, it looks like they're never turning back. I'll always remember Shadow the Hedgehog for this, being a product of the past, but also something that defined a generation. Sayonara, Shadow the Hedgehog.
Very hard to keep us hidden.
My God. Project Shadow.
Hey everybody, this is a last minute unscripted thing I wanted to do at the end of the video. I just want to say thank you so much if you've made it to the end of this video and you enjoyed it. If you want to let me know to make more content like this, please like, subscribe, share it, all that. I really appreciate it. If you didn't like the video, tell me what you didn't like. If you liked it, please comment. If you like the content like this and you want to check out more video essays from me, I will make some more in the future. I have made a video essay on an anime that I used to really like called Attack on Titan, and if you want to check out the video where I talk about how Mikasa, one of the characters in the series, was mishandled, please check out this video right here. and give that one some love too. I'd like to give a few thank yous to all the people who would help me out with this video process, all the people that cheered me on, all the people that gave me prep and encouragement to do this. It really means a lot. I'd like to give a special thank you also to Jason Griffith, who I met at a comic shop. He signed my copy of Shadow the Hedgehog, and he just encouraged me to do the video as well.
Josh, Shadow the Hedgehog here to let you know. If the world chooses to become my enemy, I will fight like I always have! Chaos Control! Nothing happened. Well, I guess I don't have to fight.
We need that damn fourth Chaos Emerald.
Where's that damn fourth Chaos Emerald? Oh, there it is.
I love you, Jason, and I hope you're doing well. As for me, I'm gonna go see that Sonic movie now. Yeah, the day it's uploaded, this video is uploaded, is the day the Sonic movie, the third one, comes out. So, yeah, I'm gonna go see that. Yeah, I got really nothing else. I guess I'll see you guys later. Have a good one.